To his room and poured himself a whisky and sat in the darkening twilight, wondering what the devil he was going to do with himself during the holidays. If only he'd been younger, he'd been inclined to join Major Featherington's walkabout in Wales, but no, he'd looked damn silly now, and anyway, the Major didn't like anyone poaching on his own private ground. It was a fairly desperate Gladstone who finally took himself off to bed and spent half an hour reading the 39 Steps again. "By the hell can't something challenging come my way for once?" he thought, as he switched out the light. A week later, it did. As the last coach left for the station and the cars departed, Slime struck. The school secretary's office was conveniently empty when he tucked the envelope addressed to G.P. Gladstone, Esquire, into the pigeonhole already jammed with Gladstone's uncollected mail. Slime's timing was nicely calculated. Gladstone was notorious for not bothering with letters until the pigeonhole was full. "Load of bump," he had once declared. "Anyone would think I was a pen pusher and not a schoolmaster." But with the end of term he would be forced to deal with his correspondence. Even so, he would leave it until the last moment. It was in fact 3 days before Gladstone took the bundle of letters up to his room and shuffled through them, and came to the envelope with the familiar crest, an eagle evidently tearing the entrails from a sheep. For a moment Gladstone gazed almost rapturously at the crest before splitting the envelope open with a paper knife. Again he hesitated. Letters from parents were too often lists of complaints about the treatment of their sons. Gladstone held his breath as he took it out and laid it flat on the desk. But his fears were unfounded. "Dear Mr. Gladstone," he read, "I trust you will forgive me writing to you, but I have no one else to turn to, and although we have never met, Anthony has expressed such admiration for you, indeed maintains you are the only gentleman among the masters at Groxbourne, that I feel you alone can be trusted." Gladstone reread the sentence. He had never suspected the wretched Wonderby of such perception, and then continued in a ferment of excitement. "I dare express nothing in a letter, for fear that it will be intercepted, except that I am in the greatest danger, and urgently need help in a situation which is as hazardous as it is honourable. Beyond that I cannot go in writing. Should you feel able to give me that assistance I so desperately require, go to the left luggage office at Victoria Station and exchange the enclosed ticket. I can say no more, but know you will understand the necessity for this precaution." The letter was signed, "Yours in desperation, Deirdre de Montcalm. P.S. Burn both the letter and the envelope at once." Gladstone sat transfixed. The call he had been awaiting for over 30 years had finally come. He read the letter several times, and then, taking the left luggage ticket which he put into his wallet, he ceremoniously burnt the letter in its envelope, and, as an extra precaution, flushed the ashes down the lavatory. Seconds later, he was packing, and within the half-hour the Bentley rolled from the coach-house with a rejuvenated Gladstone behind the wheel. From the window of his rooms in the tower, Slime watched him leave with a different excitement. The loathsome Gladstone had taken the bait. Then Slime, too, carried his bags down to his car and left Groxbourne, though less hurriedly. He would always be one step ahead of his enemy. Chapter 8. It was late afternoon by the time Gladstone parked the Bentley in a street near Victoria Station. He had driven down in a state of euphoria, interspersed with occasional flashes of insight, which told him the whole affair was too good to be true. There must be some mistake. Certainly his judgment of Wonderby had been wholly wrong. What had that letter said? "Maintains that you are the only gentleman among the masters," which was true enough, but he'd hardly expected Wonderby to have recognized it. Still, the boy's mother was La Comtesse, and he evidently knew a gentleman when he saw one. But for the most part, Gladstone had spent the drive concentrating on ways of reaching the Chateau Carmagnac as speedily as possible. It would depend on what message he found at the left luggage office, but if he took the Weymouth to Cherbourg ferry, he could drive through the night and be there in 24 hours. He had his passport with him and had stopped at his bank in Bridgnorth to withdraw £2,000 from his deposit account and change them into traveller's cheques. It was the sum total of his savings, but he still had his small inheritance to fall back on. Not that money counted in his calculations. He was about to embark on the expedition of his dreams. He was also going alone. It was at this point that a feeling of slight disappointment crept over him. In his fantasies, he had always seen himself accompanied by one or two devoted friends, a small band of companions whose motto would be that of the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. Of course, when he was young it had been different, but at 50, Gladstone felt the need for company. If only he could have taken young Clyde Brown with him, but there was no time for that now. He must act with speed. But the message he found waiting for him at the left luggage office changed his opinion. He had been rather surprised to find that it was in fact a piece of luggage, a small brown suitcase. "Are you sure this is the article?" he asked the attendant, rather incautiously. "Listen, mate, it's yours, isn't it?" "You give me the ticket for it, and that's the luggage," said the man, and turned away to deal with another customer. Gladstone glanced at a label tied to the handle and was satisfied. Neatly typed on it was his own name. He walked back to the car with a new sense of caution, and twice stopped at a corner to make sure he was not being followed. Then, with the case on the seat beside him, he drove to the flat of an aged aunt in Highgate, which he was forced to use when he was in London. In keeping with his background, Gladstone would have much preferred his club, the ancient automobile, but it didn't run to rooms. "Well, I never. If it isn't Gerald," said the old lady, rather gratuitously in Gladstone's opinion, "and you didn't even write to say you were coming." "I didn't have time. Urgent business," said Gladstone. "It's a good thing that your room is still ready, just as you left it, though I'll have to put a hot water bottle in to air the sheets. Now just you sit down and I'll make a nice pot of tea." But Gladstone was in no mood for these domestic details. They clashed too prosaically with his excitement. All the same, his aunt disappeared into the kitchen while he went up to his room and opened his suitcase. Inside, it was stuffed with French newspapers, and it was only when he had taken them all out that he found the second envelope. He ripped it open and took out several sheets of notepaper. They were all crested, and the handwriting was unmistakably that of La Comtesse. "Dear Mr. Gladstone, thank you for coming thus far," he read. "It was to be expected of you, but, though I would have you come to my aid, I fear extremely you do not appreciate the dangers you will face, and I would not put you at your peril without fair warning. Desperate as my situation is, I cannot allow you to come unprepared. Those about me are wise in the ways of crime, whereas you are not. This is perhaps to your advantage, but for your own sake and for mine, be on your guard, and come, if you can, armed, for this is a matter of life and death, and murder has already been done." "Your tea's ready, dear," the old lady called from her cluttered sitting-room. "All right, I'll be there in a moment," said Gladstone irritably. Here he was, about to engage in a matter of life and death, and with murder already done, and aged aunts who called him dear and served tea were distinctly out of place. He read on. "I enclose the route you must follow. The ports are watched, and on no account must you appear to be other than an English gentleman touring through France. It is vital, therefore, that you take your time and trust no one. The men against whom you are set have agents amongst the gendarmerie and are themselves above suspicion. I cannot state their influence too highly, nor dare I catalogue their crimes in writing." This time the letter was signed, "Yours in gratitude, Deirdre de Montcalm," and as before, the postscript ordered him to burn both letter and envelope. Gladstone turned to the other page. It was typewritten, and stated that he was to cross from Dover to Ostend on the early morning ferry of the 28th of July and drive to Ypres before passing the frontier into France the following day. Thereafter, his route was listed with hotels at which rooms have been booked for you. Gladstone read down the list in amazement. Considering the terrible dangers La Comtesse was evidently facing, her instructions were quite extraordinarily explicit. Only when he turned the page was there an explanation. In her own handwriting she had written, "Should I have need to communicate with you, my messages will be waiting for you in your rooms each night. And now that I have written this by hand, please copy and then burn." Gladstone reached in the pocket for a pen, only to be interrupted by his aunt. "Your tea's getting cold, dear." "Damn," said Gladstone, but went through to the sitting-room and spent an extremely impatient half an hour listening to the latest family gossip. By the time Aunt Lucy got on to the various diseases her grandnieces and nephews had been suffering from, Gladstone was practically rabid. "Excuse me, but I have some really pressing business to attend to," he said, as she launched into a particularly clinical account of the symptoms his cousin Michael had contracted, or more precisely, expanded, as a result of mumps. "Balls," continued Aunt Lucy implacably. "I beg your pardon," said Gladstone, whose attention had been fixed on La Comtesse's instructions. "I was saying that I simply must go," said Gladstone, and rather rudely left the room. "What a very peculiar boy Gerald is," muttered the old lady as she cleared away the tea things. Her opinion was confirmed some 40 minutes later when she discovered the hallway was filling with smoke. "What in heaven's name are you doing in there?" she demanded of the door to the lavatory, which seemed to be the source of the fire. "Nothing," choked Gladstone, wishing to God he hadn't been so conscientious in following La Comtesse's instructions to burn all evidence. The letter and his itinerary had gone easily enough, but his attempt to screw the envelope into a ball and catch the flood had failed dismally. The envelope remained obstinately buoyant, with the crest plainly visible, and the cistern had been no great help either. Built for a more leisurely age, it filled slowly and emptied no faster. Finally, Gludston had resorted to the French newspapers. They were incriminating too, and by crumpling them up around the sodden envelope, he might get that to burn as well. In the event, he was proved right, but at a considerable cost. The newspapers were as fiery as their editorials. As flames shot out of the pan, Gludston slammed the lid down and was presently tugging at the chain to extinguish what amounted to an indoor bonfire. It was at this point that his aunt intervened. "Yes, you are," she shouted through the door. "You've been smoking in there, and something's caught fire." "Yes," gasped Gludston, finding this a relatively plausible explanation. Nobody could say that he hadn't been smoking. The damn stuff was issuing round the edges of the lid quite alarmingly. He seized the towel from behind the door and tried to choke the smoke off before he suffocated. "If you don't come out this minute, I shall be forced to call the fire brigade," his aunt threatened, but Gludston had had enough. Unlocking the door, he shot, gasping for air, into the hall. His aunt surveyed the smoke still fuming from beneath the seat. "What on earth have you been up to?" she said, and promptly extinguished the smouldering remnants of Le Monde with a basin of water from the kitchen, before examining the fragments with a critical eye. "You've been a bachelor too long," she declared finally. "Your Uncle Martin was found dead in the lavatory with a copy of La Vie Parisienne, and you've obviously taken after him. What you need is a sensible wife to take care of your baser needs." Gludston said nothing. If his aunt chose to draw such crude conclusions, it was far better that she do so than suspect the true nature of his enterprise. All the same, the incident had taken a measure of the immediate glamour out of the situation. "I shall be dining out," he said with some hauteur, and spent the evening at his club, planning his next move. It was complicated by the date of his cross-channel booking, which was set for the 28th. He had 5 days to wait, and then there was the question of obtaining arms. The letter had definitely said, "Come armed," but that was easier said than done. True, he had a shotgun at a cousin's farm in Devon, but shotguns didn't come into the category of proper arms. He needed a revolver, something easy to conceal in the Bentley, and he could hardly go into a gunsmith in London and ask for a .38 Smith & Wesson with 100 cartridges. The thing to do would be to approach some member of the underworld. There must be plenty of people selling guns in London. Gludston didn't know any, and had not the foggiest notion where to look for them. It was all very disconcerting, and he was about to give up the notion of going armed when he remembered that Major Featherington kept revolvers and ammunition in the school armoury. In fact, there were several old ones there, and he knew where the Major kept the keys. It would be a simple matter to take one, and he could have it back before the beginning of next term. With a more cheerful air, Gludston ordered a brandy before returning to his aunt's flat. Next morning he was on the road again, and by lunchtime back at Groxbourne. "Fancy you coming back so soon," said the school secretary. "The galloping Major's back too, only he isn't galloping quite so much. Been and gone and sprained his ankle." "Damnation," said Gludston, horrified at this blow to his plan. "I mean, poor fellow, where is he?" "Up in his rooms." Gludston climbed the staircase to the Major's rooms and knocked. "Come in, whoever you are," shouted the Major. He was sitting in an armchair with one leg propped up on a stool. "Ah, Gloddy, old boy. Good to see you. Thought you had shoved off." "I had to come back for something. What on earth happened? Did you slip on some scree in Wales?" "Never got to bloody Wales. Glissaded on a dog turd in Shrewsbury and came a right perler, I can tell you. All I could do to drive that damn minibus back here. Had to cancel the OU course, and now I've got old Perry on my hands." "Peregrine Clyde Brown?" asked Gludston with rising hope. "Parents off in Italy somewhere. Won't be back for 3 weeks, and he's been trying to phone some uncle, but the chap's never in. Blowed if I know what to do with the lad." "How long is that ankle of yours going to take to mend?" asked Gludston, suddenly considering the possibility that he might have found just the two people he would most like to have with him in a tight spot. "Quack's fixed me up for an X-ray tomorrow. Seems to think I might have fractured my coccyx." "Your coccyx? I thought you said you'd sprained your ankle." "Listen, old man," said the Major conspiratorially, "that's for public consumption. Can't have people going round saying I bought it where the monkey hid the nuts. Wouldn't inspire confidence, would it? I mean, would you trust a son of yours to go on a survival course with a man who couldn't spot a dog pat when he was staring him in the face?" "Well, as a matter of fact, I don't—" began Gludston, only to be interrupted by the Major, who was shifting his posterior on what appeared to be a semi-inflated plastic lifebelt. "Another thing the head don't know, so for Lord's sake don't mention a word. The blighter's only too anxious to find an excuse for closing the OU course down. Can't afford to lose my job." "You can rely on me," said Gludston. "Is there anything I can get you?" The Major nodded. "A couple of bottles of whiskey." "Can't ask Matron to get it for me. Bad enough having her help me to the loo, and then she hangs about outside asking if I need any help. I'll tell you, old boy, everything they say about passing razor blades is spot on. I'll see to the whisky, said Gloucester, not wishing to pursue this line of conversation any further. It was obvious that the Major was a broken reed as far as the great adventure was concerned. He went downstairs in search of Peregrine. He had no difficulty. The sound of shots coming from the small arms range indicated where Peregrine was. Gloucester found him using a 2-2 to puncture the centre of a target. For a moment he watched with delight and then stepped forward. "Gosh, sir, it's good to see you," said Peregrine enthusiastically and scrambled to his feet. "I thought you had left." Gloucester switched his monocle to his good eye. "Something's turned up. The big show," he said. Peregrine looked puzzled. "The big show, sir?" Gloucester looked cautiously round the range before replying. "The call to action," he said solemnly. "I can't give any details except to say that it's a matter of life and death." "Gosh, sir, you mean—" "Let's just say I've been asked to help. Now, as I understand it, your folks are in Italy, and you've nothing on." For a moment, Peregrine's literal mind struggled with the statement before he caught its meaning. "No, sir. I've been trying to phone my uncle, but I can't get through." "In which case, you won't be missed. That's number one. Number two is we've 3 weeks in which to do the job. I take it you've got a passport?" Peregrine shook his head. Gloucester polished his monocle thoughtfully. "In that case, we'll have to think of something." "You mean we're going abroad?" "To France," said Gloucester. "That is, if you're game. Before you answer, you must know that we'll be acting outside the law with no holds barred. I mean, it won't be any picnic." But Peregrine was already enthralled. "Of course I'm game, sir. You can count me in." "Good man," said Gloucester and clapped him on the shoulder. "Now, as to a passport, I've an idea. Didn't Mr. Massey take the 5th form French to Boulogne last year?" "Yes, sir." "And Barnes had flu and couldn't go. If I'm not wrong, the bursar said he'd kept his temporary visitor's passport back. It could be he still has it in his office." "But I don't look a bit like Barnes." Gloucester smiled. "You will by the time you cross," he said. "We'll see to that. And now for weapons. You don't by any chance have the key to the armoury, do you?" "Well, yes, sir. The Major said I could keep my eye in so long as I didn't blow my head off." "In that case, we'll pay the gunroom a visit. We need to go armed, and 2 revolvers won't be missed." "They will, sir," said Peregrine. "The Major always checks the guns." "I can't see him doing it in his present condition," said Gloucester. "Still, I don't like going unprepared." For once, Peregrine had the answer. "There's a smashing shop for replica guns in Birmingham, sir. I mean, if we—" "Splendid," said Gloucester. "The Major wants some whisky. We can kill 2 birds with 1 stone." That evening the substitutions were made, and 2 38 Webleys with several hundred rounds of ammunition were stored in cardboard boxes beneath the seats of the Bentley. And the problem of the passport had been solved too. Gloucester had found Barnes's in the bursar's office. "Now it remains to convince the Major that you're going to your uncle's. Tell him you're catching the 10 o'clock train, and I'll pick you up at the bus stop in the village. We don't want to be seen leaving the school together, so hop along to his room and then turn in. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Gloucester went up to his rooms and sat on in the evening sunlight, studying his route on the map and sipping pink gins. It was 9 before he remembered the Major's scotch and took him the 2 bottles. "Bless you, old lad," said the Major. "You'll find a couple of glasses in the cupboard. Saved my life. And Poe is off to his uncle's tomorrow." "Really?" said Gloucester. "Anyway, you're very good health." "Going to need it by the feel of things. Bloody nuisance being cooped up here with no one much to chat to. Are you staying round for long?" Gloucester hesitated. He was fond of the Major, and the whisky coming on top of his pink gins had added to the intoxication he felt at the prospect of his adventure. "Strictly between these 4 walls," he said. "And I do mean strictly. The most extraordinary thing has happened." He hesitated. The Countess had asked for the utmost secrecy, but there was no harm in telling the Major, and if anything went wrong, it would help to have someone know. "I've had a summons from la Comtesse de Montcalm, Wanderby's mater. Apparently she's in terrible trouble and needs me—" "Must be," said the Major unsympathetically, but Gloucester was too drunk to get the message. By the time he'd finished, Major Featherington had downed several stiff whiskies in quick succession and was looking at him peculiarly. "Listen, Gloddy, you can't be serious. You must have dreamed this up." "I most certainly haven't," said Gloucester. "It's what I've been waiting for all my life, and now it's come. I always knew it would. It's destiny." "Oh, well, it's your pigeon. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. I know how you're placed and all that, but do remember, you're sworn to secrecy. No one, but no one, must know. I want your hand on that." "If you say so," said the Major. "Shake a paw. No names, no pact drill and all that. You can rely on me, all the same. Pass the bottle. So you're crossing to Ostend?" "Yes," said Gloucester, and got up unsteadily. "Better get some shut-eye." He wove to the door and went downstairs. On the way, he met the matron and ignored her. She held no attractions for him now. La Comtesse de Montcalm wanted him, and the great romance of his life had begun. He crossed the quad. A light was burning in Peregrine's dormitory, but Gloucester didn't see it. "Fuck me," said the Major, unfortunately just as the matron entered. Peregrine shut the book and turned out the light. He had just finished The Day of the Jackal. Chapter 9. In Ramsgate, Slime hardly slept. Away from Groxbourne and in the saner atmosphere of his mother's house, Slime could see considerable weaknesses in his plan. To begin with, he had forged 2 letters from the Countess, and if Gladstone hadn't followed instructions to burn the confounded things and actually produce them to her, things could become exceedingly awkward. The woman might well call the police in, and they would probably find his fingerprints on the letters. At least Slime supposed they could, with modern methods of forensic science, and even if they didn't, there was still the matter of the hotel bookings. As far as he could see, this was his most fatal mistake. He should never have made the bookings by telephone from England. If the calls were traced, the police would begin looking for motive, and from there to his own progress across France during the Easter holidays. Slime preferred not to think of the consequences. He'd lose his job at the school, and Gladstone would gloat over his exposure. In fact, he could see now that the whole thing had been a ghastly mistake, a mental aberration that was likely to wreck his career. So, while Gladstone and Peregrine drove to London next day and booked into separate rooms, one with a bathroom, Slime concentrated on means of stopping the scheme he had so successfully started. Possibly the best way would be to send a telegram to the school purporting to come from the Countess and countermanding the instructions. Slime decided against it. For one thing, they always phoned telegrams before sending the printed message, and the school secretary would take the call. And for another, Gladstone had probably left no forwarding address. To make absolutely certain, Slime took the opportunity, while his mother was out shopping, to put a large wad of cotton wool very uncomfortably in his mouth to disguise his voice and phone the school. As he anticipated, the secretary answered. "No, Mr. Slime," she said to his horror. "You've just missed him. I mean, he was here till yesterday, but he's gone now. And you know what he's like about letters anyway. I mean, they pile up in his pigeonhole, even in term time. And he never does leave a forwarding address. Is there anything I can tell him if he comes back again?" "No," said Slime. "And my name isn't Slime. It's Fortescue. Just say Mr. Fortescue phoned." "If you say so, Mr. Fortescue, though you sound just like one of the masters here. He had ever such bad toothache the term before last, and—" Slime had put the phone down and removed the wad of cotton wool. There had to be some way of stopping Gladstone. Perhaps if he were to make an anonymous phone call to the French customs authorities that Gladstone was a drug smuggler, they would turn him back at the frontier. No, phone calls were out, and in any case there was no reason to suppose the French customs official would believe him. Worse still, the attempt might provoke Gladstone into some more desperate action, such as crossing the frontier on foot and hiring a car once he was safely in France and driving straight to the chateau. Having opened the Pandora's box of Gladstone's adolescent imagination, it was going to prove exceedingly difficult to close the damn thing. And everything depended on Gladstone having burnt those incriminating letters. Why hadn't he considered the possibility that the man might keep them as proof of his bona fides? The answer was because Gladstone was such a fool. But was he? Slime's doubts increased. Putting himself in Gladstone's shoes, he decided he would have kept the letters just in case the whole thing was a hoax. And again, now that he came to think of it, the instruction to burn every piece of correspondence was distinctly fishy and could well have made Gladstone suspicious. As his doubts and anxieties increased, Slime decided to act. He packed a bag, found his passport, took the file containing the photographs of the Countess's letter, together with several sheets of crested notepaper and envelopes, and was ready to leave when his mother returned from her shopping. "But I thought you said you were going to stay at home this summer," she said. "After all, you had a continental holiday at Easter, and it's not as though you can afford to go gallivanting about." "I shall be back in a few days," said Slime, "and I'm not gallivanting anywhere. This is strictly business." He left the house in a huff and drove to the bank for more travellers' checks. That afternoon he was in Dover and had joined the queue of cars waiting for the ferry when he was horrified to see Gladstone's conspicuous green Bentley parked to one side before the barrier to the booking office. There was no doubt about it. The number plate was GUY 444. The bastard was disregarding the Countess's instructions and was leaving earlier than he was meant to. Crossing to Calais and sending a telegram from the Countess addressed to Gladstone care of the Dover-Ostend ferry was out of the question, and Slime was already committed to taking the Calais ferry himself. As the queue of cars slowly moved through the customs and immigration and down the ramp into the ship, Slime's agony increased. Why the hell couldn't the man have done what he was told? And further awful implications were obvious. Gladstone's suspicions had been aroused, and while he was still committed to the adventure, he was following an itinerary of his own. More alarming still, he was travelling on the same ship and might well recognise Slime's cortina on the car deck. With these fears plaguing him, Slime disappeared into the ship's toilet, where he was prematurely sick several times before the ship got under way. Very furtively, he went up on deck and stared at the retreating quay in the hope that the Bentley would still be there. It wasn't. Slime drew the obvious conclusion and spent the rest of the voyage in a corner seat, pretending to read The Guardian and hiding his face from passers-by. He was therefore in no position to observe a young man with unnaturally black hair who leaned over the ship's rail and was travelling under a temporary passport made out in the name of William Barnes. In the end, unable to stand the suspense, Slime slipped down to the car deck as soon as the French coast was sighted and made a hurried inventory of the cars. Gladstone's Bentley was not among them. And when he drove off the ship at Calais and followed the toute direction sign, he was even more confused. Presumably Gladstone was crossing on the next ferry. Or was he going to Boulogne, or even sticking to his original instructions to travel by Ostend? Slime turned into a side road and parked beneath a block of flats, and having considered all the permutations of times and ferry crossings and destinations, decided there was only one way to find out. With a sense of doom, Slime walked back to the office, and was presently asking the overworked clerk in broken French if he could trace a Monsieur Gladstone. The clerk looked at him incredulously, and replied in perfect English, "Mr. Gladstone? You are seriously asking me if I can tell you if a Mr. Gladstone has crossed, is crossing, or intends to cross from Dover to Calais, Dover to Boulogne, or Dover to Ostend?" "Oui," said Slime, sticking to his supposedly foreign identity. "Je suis." "Well, you can swee off," said the clerk. "I've got about 800 ruddy cars crossing on the hour, by the hour, and thousands of passengers, and if you think—" "Sa femme est morte," said Slime. "C'est très important." "His wife's dead? Well, that's a different matter, of course. I'll put out a general message to all ferries." "No, don't do that," Slime began, but the man had already disappeared into a back office and was evidently relaying the dreadful news to some senior official. Slime turned and fled. God alone knew how Gladstone would respond to the news that he was now a widower, when he'd never had a wife. With a fresh sense of despair, Slime scurried back to his car and drove wildly out of Calais with one overriding intention. Whether Gladstone arrived at Calais or Boulogne or Ostend, he would still have to come south to reach the Chateau Carmagnac, and with any luck would stick to the route he'd been given. At least Slime hoped to hell he would, and since it was the only hope he had, he clung to it. He might be able to head the swine off, and the best place to start would be Ivry-la-Bataille. The place had the sort of romantic picturesqueness that would most appeal to Gladstone, and the hotel he'd booked him into there was highly recommended in the Guide Gastronomique. As he drove through the night, Slime prayed that Gladstone's stomach would prove his ally. He need not have been so concerned. Gladstone was still in Britain, and had worries of his own. They mostly concerned Peregrine and the discrepancy between his appearance, as altered by dyeing his hair dark brown, and that of William Barnes, as depicted on his passport. The transformation had taken place in the London hotel. Gladstone had sent Peregrine out with instructions to get some dye from a chemist, and had told him to get on with it. It had been a bad mistake. Peregrine had been booked into the hotel an unremarkable blonde, and left it 16 hours and 10 towels later, looking, in Gladstone's opinion, like something no bigoted immigration officer would let out of the country, never mind allow in. "I didn't tell you to take a bath in the blasted stuff," said Gladstone, surveying the filthy brew in the tub and the stained towels. "I told you to dye your hair." "I know, sir, but there weren't any instructions about hair." "What the hell do you mean?" said Gladstone, who wished now that he had supervised the business instead of protecting his reputation as a non-consenting adult by having tea in the lounge. "What did it say on the bottle?" "It was a powder, sir, and I followed what they said to do for wool." "Wool?" Peregrine groped for a sodden and practically illegible piece of paper. "I tried to find hair, but all they had down was polyester cotton mixtures, heavy-duty nylon, acetate rayon and wool, so I chose wool. I mean, it seemed safer. All the other ones said to simmer for 10 minutes. "Dear Lord," said Gladstone, and grabbed the paper. It was headed Dye Perm, the non-fade all-purpose dye. By the time he had deciphered the instructions, he looked despairingly round the room again. Non-fade all-purpose was about right. Even the bath mat was indelibly dyed with footprints. "I told you to get hair dye, not something suitable for ties, batik and macrame. It's a miracle you're still alive. This muck's made for blasted washing machines." "But they only had stuff called hair rinse at the chemist, and that didn't seem much use, so I know what you did," said Gladstone. "The thing is, how the devil do we explain these towels? Good God, it's even stained the shower curtains, and they're plastic. I wouldn't have believed it possible. And how on earth did it get up the wall like that? He must have been spraying the filth all over the room. Well, that was when I had a shower afterwards, sir. It said rinse thoroughly. I did in the shower, and some got in my mouth, so I spat it out. Tasted blooming horrible. It smells singularly foul, too, said Gladstone gloomily. If you'll take my advice, you'll empty that bath and try and get the stain off the enamel with some vim, and then have another bath in clean water. And retreating to the bar for several pink gins, he left Peregrine to do what he could to make himself look less like something the Race Relations Board would find hard to qualify. In the event, Dye Perm didn't live up to its promise, and Peregrine came down to dinner unrecognisable, but at least moderately unstained, except for his hair and eyebrows. Well, that's a relief, said Gladstone. All the same, I think it's best to get you on the most crowded ferry tomorrow, and hope to hell you'll pass in a crowd. I'll tell the manager here you had an accident with a bottle of ink. Yes, sir. And what do I do when I get to France? Asked Peregrine. See a doctor if you feel at all peculiar, said Gladstone. No, I mean, where do I go? Well, we'll buy a rail ticket through to Armentières, and you'll book into the hotel nearest the station, and be sure not to leave it, except to go to the station every 2 hours. I'll try and make it across Belgium as fast as I can, and remember this. If you're stopped at Calais, my name must not be mentioned. Invent some story about always wanting a trip to France and pinching the passport yourself. You mean lie, sir? Gladstone's fork, halfway to his mouth, hovered a moment and returned to his plate. Peregrine's peculiar talent for taking everything he was told literally was beginning to unsettle him. Well, if you must put it like that, yes, he said, with an awful patience. And stop calling me sir. We're not at school now, and one slip of the tongue would give the game away. From now on, I'll call you Bill, and you can address me as, Patton. Yes, sir, Patton, said Peregrine. Even so, it was a worried Gladstone who went to bed that night, and who, after an acrimonious discussion with the hotel manager on the matter of towels, took the Dover Road next morning with Peregrine beside him. With understandable haste, he booked him as William Barnes on the ferry and by train to Armentières, and then hurried away before the ship sailed. For the rest of the day, he lay on the cliff above the terminal, scanning returning passengers through his binoculars in the hope that Peregrine wouldn't be among them. In between whiles he checked his stores of tinned food, the camping gas stove and saucepan, the picnic hamper and the 2 sleeping bags and tent. Finally, he taped the revolvers to the springs below the seats and, unscrewing the ends of the tent poles, hid the ammunition inside them. And as the weather was good, and there was no sign of Peregrine being dragged ashore by immigration officers, his spirits rose. After all, nothing ventured, nothing gained, he replied tritely to a gull that shrieked above him. In the clear summer air he could see faint on the horizon the coastline of France. Tomorrow he'd be there. That evening, while Peregrine struggled to explain to the desk clerk that he wanted a room at the hotel in Armentières, and Slime drove desperately towards Ivry-la-Bataille, Gladstone dined at a country pub, and then went down to the ferry terminal to confirm his booking to Ostend next morning. Did you say your name was Gladstone, sir? Inquired the clerk. I did, said Gladstone, and was alarmed when the man excused himself and went to another office with an odd look on his face. A more senior official with an even odder look came out. "She'll just come this way, Mr. Gladstone," he said mournfully, and opened the door of a small room. "What for?" said Gladstone, now thoroughly worried. "I'm afraid I have some rather shocking news for you, sir. Perhaps if you took a seat." "What shocking news?" said Gladstone, who had a shrewd idea what he was in for. "It concerns your wife, sir." "My wife?" Yes, Mr. Gladstone, I'm sorry to have to tell you." "But I haven't got a wife," said Gladstone, fixing the man with his monocle. "Ah, then you know already," said the man. "You have my most profound sympathy. I lost my own 3 years ago. I know just how you must feel." "I very much doubt if you do," said Gladstone, whose feelings were veering all over the place. "In fact, I'd go so far as to say you can't." But the man was not to be denied his compassion. The years behind the booking counter had given him the gift of consoling people. "Perhaps not," he murmured. "As the bard says, marriages are made in heaven, and we must all cross that bourne from which no traveller returns." He cast a watery eye at the channel, but Gladstone was in no mood for multiple misquotations. "Listen," he said, "I don't know where you got this idea that I'm married, because I'm not. And since I'm not, I'd be glad to hear how I can have lost my wife." "But you are Mr. G.P. Gladstone, booked for the Ostend boat tomorrow morning." "Yes, and what's more, there isn't any Mrs. Gladstone, and never has been." "That's odd," said the man. "We had a message from Calais just now for a Mr. Gladstone saying that his wife had died, and you're the only Mr. Gladstone on any of the booking lists. I'm exceedingly sorry to have distressed you." "Yes, well, since you have," said Mr. Gladstone, who was beginning to find the message even more sinister than the actual death of any near relative, "I'd like to hear who sent it." The man went back into the office and phoned through to Calais. "Apparently a man came in speaking French with a strong English accent and wanted to find out on which ferry you were crossing," he said. "He wouldn't speak English, and the clerk there wouldn't tell him where you were landing. So the man said to tell you your wife had died." "Did the clerk describe the man?" "I didn't ask him, and frankly, since—" But Gladstone's monocle had its effect, and he went back to the phone. He returned with the information that the man had disappeared as soon as he'd delivered the message. Gladstone had made up his mind. "I think I'll change my booking," he said. "Is there any space on tonight's ferries?" There's some on the midnight one, but—" "Good, then I'll take it," said Gladstone, maintaining his authority. "And on no account is that fellow to be given any information about my movements." "We don't make a habit of handing out information of that sort," said the man. I take very great exception to the idea." "And I take exception to being told that a wife I don't have has just died," said Gladstone. At midnight he took the ferry and was in Belgium before dawn. As he drove out of the docks, Gladstone kept his eyes skinned for any suspicious watchers, but the place was dark and empty. Of one thing Gladstone was now certain. La Comtesse had not been exaggerating the brilliant criminal intelligence he was up against. That they knew he was coming was proof enough of that. There was also the terrible possibility that the message had been a warning. "If they touch one hair of her head," Gladstone muttered ferociously, and adjusted his goggles as the Bentley ate the miles towards Ypres and the obscure frontier crossing beyond it. Chapter 10. "Gosh, it's good to see you, sir. I mean Patton, sir," said Peregrine when the Bentley drew up outside the railway station that morning. Gladstone peered at him from behind his one-eyed goggles, and had to admit that he was fairly pleased to see Peregrine. He was terribly tired, had had no sleep for 24 hours, and the border crossing Slime had chosen for him had been so obscure that he'd spent several hours trying to find it. "I'll get some breakfast while you fetch your kit from the hotel," he said. "I don't want to be delayed here too long, so step lively. You see, they know I'm coming. But that you're with me, they do not know." And with this strangely accurate remark, Gladstone climbed down and entered a café, where to his disgust he was forced to make do with café au lait and croissant. Half an hour later, the Bentley, which had attracted a disconcerting number of vintage car buffs around it, was once more on the road. "Well, we've stolen a march on them so far," said Gladstone, "but there's no doubt they know La Comtesse has been in communication with me. Which goes to show she has been badly served. And so from now on we must be on our guard and keep our eyes open for anything suspicious." And he recounted the story of the man who had visited the booking office at Calais and left the warning message. "Which means they may be holding her against our coming." "Your wife?" said Peregrine. "I didn't know you had one." For a moment Gladstone took his eye off the road to glare at him, and looked back just in time to avoid crushing a herd of cows that was blocking the way. "La Comtesse, you oaf!" he shouted as the car screeched to a halt. "Oh, her," said Peregrine. In that case, why did they say your wife was dead?" To vent his fury and avoid actual violence, Gladstone sounded the horn. Ahead of them the cows mooched on their way unperturbed. "Because," said Gladstone with barely controlled patience, "not even the most brazen swine would walk up to a booking clerk and say, 'Tell Mr. Gladstone that if he comes any further La Comtesse will die.' The last thing they want to do is to bring the police in." "No, I suppose they don't. Still—" "And another thing," continued Gladstone before Peregrine could send his blood pressure up any further by his obtuseness, "the fellow inquired which ferry I was taking, which tells me this. They don't know I was crossing via Ostend. At least they didn't last night, and it will take them time to find out, and by then we must have reached the chateau. It's surprise that counts, so we'll press on." "When those cows get out of the way," said Peregrine, "you don't suppose they're blocking the road on purpose?" For a few seconds Gladstone eyed him incredulously. "No," he said, "I don't." Presently they were able to drive on. As they drove, Gladstone's mind wrestled with the problem of hotels. La Comtesse had arranged the bookings to enable her to communicate with him en route, and if he avoided them and pushed on, there was the danger that he might miss a vital message. Against that, there was the need for speed. In the end, Gladstone compromised, and when they reached Gisors, where he had been scheduled to spend the first night, he sent Peregrine in to cancel the room. "Explain that I've been taken ill and won't be coming," he said, "and if there are any messages for me, collect them." He parked the Bentley out of sight round the corner, and Peregrine went into the hotel. He was back in 5 minutes. "The manager spoke English," he said. So the blighters should. After all, we've saved them from the Hun in 2 world wars, and a fat lot of thanks we've had for it. Bloody butter mountains and wine lakes and the confounded common market, said Gladstone, who had been looking forward to a short nap. And no message or letter for me? Peregrine shook his head, and Gladstone started the Bentley again. All day the great car ate the miles and a vast quantity of petrol, but Gladstone pushed along the side roads of Slime's tortuous route. It was afternoon by the time they came to Ivry-la-Bataille, and Gladstone was able to totter into the hotel and remove his goggles. "I believe you have a room reserved for me. The name is Gladstone," he said, in French that was a shade less excruciating than Slime's, and infinitely more comprehensible than Peregrine's. "But yes, monsieur, number 4. Gladstone took the key and then paused. "Has any message come for me?" The clerk looked through a stash of envelopes until he came to the familiar crest. "This was delivered this afternoon, monsieur." Gladstone took the letter and tore it open. 5 minutes later the key to his room was back on the board and Gladstone had left. "You can stop bringing the baggage in," he told Peregrine. "La Comtesse has sent a message." "A message?" said Peregrine eagerly. "Shut up and get in," said Gladstone, casting a suspicious eye round the street. "I'll explain while we go." "Well," said Peregrine when they were clear of the little town. "Take a good look at that," said Gladstone, and handed him the letter. "It's from the Countess asking you on pain of her death not to come," he said when he'd read it through. "In that case, why was it delivered by a man with an English accent who refused to speak English? In short, our friend who left the warning at Calais. And another thing, you've only got to compare her handwriting with that of the earlier letters to see that the devils have tortured her into writing it." "Good Lord, you mean—" began Peregrine, but Gladstone's mind had already fabricated a number of new conclusions. "Just this, that they know the route we're following, and where we're going to stay the night, which may be to their liking, but doesn't suit my book." "Which book?" asked Peregrine, browsing through a mental library from the 39 Steps to the Day of the Jackal, with more insight into the workings of Gladstone's mind than he knew. Gladstone ignored the remark. He was too busy planning a new strategy. "The thing is to put yourself in the other fellow's shoes," he said. "I'm sure we're being watched, or waited for. And they know we've had that message, yet we're going on. And that will give them pause for thought. You see, we've been warned off twice now. I think it's time we played their game. We'll turn back at Annay and head for Mantes, and there we'll spend the night. Tomorrow we'll rest up and tour the sights, and then tomorrow night we'll take the road again as soon as it's dark and drive for Carmagnac." "I say, that will confuse them," said Peregrine as the Bentley turned left across the Eure and headed north again. But Slime was already confused. Having driven all night to reach Ivry-la-Bataille, he hadn't dared stay there but had gone on to Dreux. There in a hotel he had penned the letter from La Comtesse and had slept briefly before returning with the ominous message for Gladstone to pick up. After that he had watched the road from a track and had seen the Bentley go by. With a muttered curse he started his Ford Cortina and followed at a discreet distance, in time to see the Bentley cross the bridge and turn a little later onto the Mantes road. For a few minutes Slime was delighted before it dawned on him that if Gladstone had intended to give up the expedition, there would have been no need for him to have left the hotel or to have taken the road south in the first place. The natural thing to do would have been to spend the night in Ivry-la-Bataille and head back towards Calais next morning. But Gladstone hadn't done the natural thing, and moreover, to complicate matters, he wasn't alone. There had been another passenger in the Bentley. Slime hadn't been able to glimpse his face, but evidently Gladstone had persuaded some other damned romantic to join him on his adventure. Another bloody complication. With a fresh sense of exasperation, he followed the Bentley and wondered what to do next. At least the great car wasn't difficult to spot and was in fact extremely conspicuous, while his own Cortina was relatively anonymous and could easily match the Bentley for speed. As they reached the outskirts of Mantes, Slime made another plan. If Gladstone left the town travelling north, well and good, but if he turned south, Slime would drive for the chateau and be ready to take action before Gladstone could get to see the Countess. What action he would take, he had no idea, but he would have to think of something. In the event, he was forced to think of other things. Instead of leaving Mantes, the Bentley pulled up outside a hotel. Slime turned into a side street. 5 minutes later, the Bentley had been unloaded and then driven into the hotel garage. Slime shuddered. Obviously Gladstone was spending the night, but there was no telling when he would leave next morning, and the idea of staying awake in case the blasted man decided to make a dawn start was not in the least appealing. Slime wasn't remaining where he was in a side street. Gladstone might, and by all the laws of nature, must be exhausted, but he was still capable of taking a stroll round the neighbourhood before going to bed, and would, if he saw it, immediately recognise the Cortina. Slime started the car and drove back the way he had come, before stopping and wondering what the hell to do next. He couldn't send yet another message from the Countess. Unless the old cow possessed second sight, she couldn't know where Gladstone had got to, and anyway, letters didn't travel several hundred miles in a couple of hours. Slime consulted the map and found no comfort in it. All roads might lead to Rome, but Mantes was a contender when it came to roads leading from it. There was even a motorway running into Paris, which they had driven under on the way into town. Slime dismissed it. Gladstone loathed motorways, and if he did turn south, again his inclination would be to stick to minor roads. By watching the intersection on the outskirts of the town, he would be in a position to follow if Gladstone took one. But the if was too uncertain for Slime's liking, and in any case, following was insufficient. He had to stop the idiot from reaching the chateau with those damning letters. Slime drove on until he found a cafe, and spent the next hour gloomily having supper and cursing the day he had ever gone to Groxbourne, and even more vehemently the day he had set up this absurd plan. Must have been mad, he muttered to himself over a second brandy, and then, having paid the bill, went back to his car and consulted the map again. This time his attention was centred on the district around the chateau. If Gladstone continued on his infernal mission, he would have to pass through Limoges and Brive, or find some tortuous byroads round them. Again, Slime considered Gladstone's peculiar psychology, and decided that the latter course would be more likely. So that put paid to any attempt to stay ahead of the brute. He would have to devise some means of following him. But for the moment he needed sleep. He found it eventually in a dingy room above the cafe, where he was kept awake by the sound of a jukebox and by obsessive thoughts that Gladstone might already have left his hotel and be driving frantically through the night towards Carmaignac. But when he got up groggily at 6, and after drinking several black coffees, walked back into town, he was reassured by the sight of the Bentley being washed down by a young man with black hair who looked strangely familiar. Slime, passing on the other side of the street, did not linger, but went into the first clothing shop he could find and emerged wearing a beret and the blue jacket he supposed would make him look like a typical French peasant. For the rest of the day, Slime lurked round corners, in cafes that commanded a view of the hotel, in shop doorways even further down the street, but Gladstone put in no appearance. He was, in fact, faced with almost the same dilemma as Slime. Having driven for 24 hours without sleep, he was exhausted, and his digestion had taken a pounding from rather too many champignons with his steak the night before. In short, he was in no condition to do any sightseeing, and was having second thoughts about La Comtesse's letter. "Clearly the swine forced her to write it," he told Peregrine, "and yet how did they know we would be staying at Ivry-la-Bataille?" "Probably tortured her until she told them," said Peregrine. "I mean, they're capable of anything." "But she is not," said Gladstone, refusing to believe that even a helpless heroine, and a countess at that, would give in to the most fiendish torture. "There's a message for us here, if we could read it." Peregrine looked at the letter again. "But we've already read it. It says—" "I know what it seems to say," snapped Gladstone. "What I want to know is what it's trying to tell us." "To go back to England, and if we don't, she'll be—" "Bill, old chap," interrupted Gladstone through clenched teeth, "what you don't seem to be able to get into that thick head of yours is that things are seldom what they appear to be. For instance, look at her handwriting." "It doesn't look bad to me," said Peregrine. "It's a bit shaky, but if you'd just been tortured, it would be, wouldn't it? I mean, if they used thumbscrews or red-hot pokers." "Dear God," said Gladstone, "what I'm trying to tell you is that La Comtesse may have written in a trembling hand with the intention of telling us she is still in trouble." "Yes," said Peregrine, "and she is, isn't she? They're going to kill her if we don't get back to Dover. She says that." "But does she mean it? But don't say yes. Oh, well, never mind. She wrote that letter under duress, I'm sure of it. More, if they could murder her with impunity, why haven't they done so already? Something else is different. In all her previous messages, La Comtesse has told me to burn the letter, but here she doesn't. And there's our cue. She means us to go on. We're going to draw their fire. We'll leave as soon as it's dark and take the road we would have gone down if we'd never read this letter." Gladstone got up and went down the corridor to the bathroom with a box of matches. He returned to the room with a fresh wave of euphoria seething up inside him, to find Peregrine staring out of the window. "I say, Patton," he whispered, "I'm sure we're being watched. There's a Frenchie on the corner, and I swear I've seen him before somewhere." "Where?" asked Gladstone, peering down into the street. "I don't know. It just looks like someone I know." "I don't mean that," said Gladstone. "I mean, where is he now?" "He's gone," said Peregrine, "but he's been hanging about all day." Good, said Gladstone with a nasty smile. Two can play that game. Tonight we'll be followed, and so we'll go armed. I'd like to hear what our watcher has to tell us, and let me know if you spot him again. But Slime did not put in another appearance. He had had an appalling day, and his feeling about thriller writers was particularly violent. The sods ought to try their hands at skulking about French towns pretending to be peasants and attempting to keep a watch on a hotel before they wrote so glibly about such things. His feet were sore, the pavements hard, the weather was foully hot, and he had drunk more cups of black coffee than were good for his nervous system. He had also been moved on by several shopkeepers who objected to being stared at for half an hour at a time by a shifty man wearing dark glasses and a beret. He also had the problem of avoiding the street outside the hotel, and this meant that he had to walk down a back alley, along another street, and up a third to vary the corners from which he watched. All in all, Slime made a rough calculation that he must have trudged 15 miles during the course of the day, and for all his pains he had learned nothing except that Gladstone hadn't left the hotel, or if he hadn't used the Bentley. And it was the Bentley that most interested Slime. As he wandered the streets or stared so menacingly into shop windows, his mind, hyped by too much caffeine, tried to devise ways of following the car without keeping it in sight. In books it was quite simple. Reality was something else again. So were boys. On the other hand, if he could only bring the Bentley to a halt in some lonely spot, Gladstone would have to leave the car and go for help. Slime remembered the time when an enterprising 14-year-old at Groxbourne had stuffed a potato up the exhaust pipe of the art master's car to such good effect that the man had had to have it towed away and the engine stripped before anyone had found out what was wrong. And there had been talk of another master's car which had been wrecked before the war by adding sugar to its petrol tank. Inspired by these memories, Slime went into a cafe and ordered a Calvados. Under its influence, and that of a second, he reversed his order of priorities. If Gladstone started south again, Slime could stay ahead of him by sticking to the main roads, but not in the Cortina. One glimpse of its number plate would give the game away. Slime left the cafe in search of a garage where he could hire a car. Having found one, he moved his luggage from the Cortina to a Citroen, bought 2 kilos of sugar, another kilo of nails, several large cans of oil at different garages, and parked near the hotel. If Gladstone left that night, he was in for a nasty surprise. Wearily, he looked at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. He would give Gladstone until midnight. But at 10:30 the Bentley's bonnet poked cautiously from the garage, paused for a moment, and then swung south. Slime let it go, and when it had turned the corner, started the car and moved after it. 5 minutes later, he watched it turn onto the Annay Road. Slime put his foot down, doing 90 on the N183, and before Gladstone could have entered the Forêt de Dreux, the Citroen was 6 kilometres ahead of him. Chapter 11. In the event, he need not have hurried. Gladstone was taking his time. Twice he had turned down side roads and switched off his lights. Because, he said, I want to give them a chance to go by. They've been waiting to see what we're going to do, and they'll follow. But they won't know which road we've taken, and they'll have to look. Yes, but when they don't find us, won't they watch the roads ahead? Asked Peregrine, who was enjoying himself, unstrapping the revolvers from their hiding places beneath the seats. Gladstone shook his head. They may later on, but for the moment they'll assume we're travelling fast. I mean, they would if they were in our shoes, but we'll move slowly. And France is a big country. If we lose them here, they'll have 1,000 roads to search much further south. And here, I think, they come. How do you know? Whispered Peregrine as a Jaguar shot past the side road. Gladstone started the Bentley. Because French headlights are yellow, and those were white, he said, and if I'm not mistaken, our Englishman at Calais is the link man. He's probably above suspicion, too, some wealthy member of the bar whose club is whites and who moves in the best circles. Now, a Jag may be a shade too flashy in London, but it'll do very well in France for speed. And with this pleasing invention, Gladstone drove the Bentley out into the road and turned sedately after the disappearing tail lights. In the Forêt de Dreux, Slime completed his preparations. He had chosen the end of a long straight with a tight corner on it for his ambush, had parked his car on a track well out of sight round the bend, and was ready to swill a can of oil on the road as soon as he saw the Bentley's headlights. It was a desperate measure, but Slime was a desperate and partially drunk man, and the memory of being called Slimy had inspired him with a grim determination. Gladstone had to be stopped, and quickly. As he waited, Slime made some further calculations. The Bentley would slow before the bend, would then hit the oil slick and skid. Slime considered its next move and decided that a log in the road would help. He found a fallen branch and had just put it down when the headlights appeared. Slime emptied the can of oil and crossed the road to be on the safe side. There he lay in the forest, waiting for his man. In the event, he was proved wrong. It was less a man than an entire family, Mr. and Mrs. Blowther from Cleethorpes and their 2 children, who were enjoying the privilege afforded by straight French roads of travelling at 100 miles an hour in their brand-new Jaguar when they hit the oil slick. For a moment they continued on their way. It was a brief respite. A second later the car slewed sideways. Mr. Blowther, under the misapprehension that both his front tyres had blown, slammed his foot on the brake. The Jaguar spun like a whirling dervish before encountering the branch, and then somersaulted through the air. As it landed on its roof and with a crescendo of breaking glass and tearing metal shot upside down round the corner, Slime knew he had made a ghastly mistake and was running for the car, or trying to. After the brilliance of the now shattered headlights, the forest was pitch black and filled with an extraordinary number of hollows, barbed bushes and invisible trees. As he came abreast of the wrecked car, the Blowthers, still miraculously alive, were crawling from the windscreen and giving vent to their outraged feelings. Mr. Blowther, convinced that the fallen branch had caused the catastrophe, was particularly vehement about fornicating French foresters and flaming fir trees, and only stopped when Mrs. Blowther more maternally began moaning about saving the children. "Save? Save?" yelled her husband, still too deafened to hear it all clearly. "Of course we'll have to save. It'll take 10 years to save enough to buy another effing Jag. You don't think that crumpled conglomeration of craftsmanship was comprehensively covered? All we had was third-party insurance, and for your beastly benefit, the only third party is that fractured flipping fir tree." In the bushes, the authentic third party shuddered. Not only had he wrecked the wrong car, but he'd just remembered the oil cans. He'd left them in the wood, and his fingerprints would be all over the things. Under cover of Mr. Blowther's demented alliteration, Slime slipped back into the forest rather more successfully now that his eyes weren't blinded by the headlights, and had reached the cans when the Bentley appeared. Slime slid into the undergrowth and prayed it would emulate the Jaguar. But his hopes were dashed by Mr. Blowther, who scampered round the corner and was endeavouring to flag down the Bentley when he encountered the oil slick. For a moment he waved frantically before losing his foothold and slumping down on the road. By the time he got to his feet 4 times, had fallen 3 and rolled into the ditch. He was not a sight to inspire confidence. Even Slime could see that. Gladstone could evidently see more. He brought the Bentley to a halt and stared at Mr. Blowther suspiciously. "Don't make another move," he called out. "You see we've got you covered." Mr. Blowther took umbrage. "Move?" he shouted. "You must be out of your bleeding mind. I can't even shuffle without falling arse over elbow, and as far as being covered, I don't know what you think I am now, but the way it feels to me, I'm a human Christmas tree. That flaming holly—" "That's enough of that," shouted Gladstone, for whom Mr. Blowther's North Country accent was further proof that he was a gangster and the whole thing an elaborate trap. "Now get your hands above your head and walk backwards, and remember, 1 false step and you're a dead man." Mr. Blowther stared into the darkness behind the great headlamps incredulously. "Listen, mate," he said, "if you think I'm going to stick my hands in the air and try and walk anywhere on this grease pan and not be a dead man, you've got another thing coming." "I shall count to 10, said Gladstone grimly. 1, 2... But Mr. Blowther had had enough. He had been through a terrible car crash and was now in the middle of a second inexplicable nightmare. He moved. To be precise, he slid sideways and landed on his shoulder before rolling back into the ditch. As he went, the Bentley started forward into the oil and, skidding this way and that, disappeared round the corner. Thanks to this veering and the erratic swing of the headlamps, Gladstone was spared the sight of the wrecked Jaguar among the trees and of the distraught Mrs. Blowther searching in the debris for her handbag and a handkerchief with which to blow the nose of a little Blowther. All his energies were concentrated on keeping the Bentley on the road. "By God," he said when the car finally steadied itself, "that was a damn near thing. It only goes to show the sort of swine we're up against." "Do you think they'll come after us?" asked Peregrine hopefully, toying with a revolver. "Certain to," said Gladstone, "but we'll give them a run for their money. There's a crossroads coming up, and I'm going to go left. From now on we'll drive straight through the night." Behind them, Slime was struggling with 2 empty oil cans and his conscience. From Mr. Blowther's vehement opinions and Mrs. Blowther's complaints about using foul language in front of the children, he had gathered that although he had been responsible for wrecking a very fine motor car, the occupants had somehow managed to escape unhurt. It was small consolation. The police would undoubtedly be called to the scene, and it would be extremely difficult to explain his presence there or the possession of the oil cans, 2 kilos of sugar, and a large quantity of nails. Worse still, he had the crested notepaper and the notes he had made for Gladstone's premeditated adventure in his suitcase. In the circumstances, it seemed wiser to make himself scarce as quickly as possible. Under cover of the Blother's acrimony, he stumbled back to the citron, put the cans in the boot, and driving without lights, followed the road by the gap of night sky between the trees. 10 miles further on, he wiped the oil cans clean of fingerprints, dumped them over a bridge into the river, and buried his handkerchief in a ditch. To make doubly sure, he poured the sugar into the river too, and drove on another mile before disposing of the nails. Finally, he burnt the rest of the notepaper in the envelopes, and drove back to Mantes, considering extradition treaties. For the first time in his life, Slime was definitely against them. He was also very much against remaining in France. Whatever Gladstone might find when he reached the chateau, and even if he still had the forged letters in his possession, Slime had no intention of spending time in a French prison for destroying a car and endangering life. It seemed best to leave the Citron at the garage and drive like hell for Calais in his own Cortina. With any luck, he would be across the Channel and safely home in Ramsgate before the police had made any headway in their investigations. And so Slime drove quietly into Mantes and spent the rest of the night trying to get some sleep in the forecourt of the rent-a-car garage. At 8 that morning, he was on the road for Calais. Far to the south, the Bentley was still covering ground. Gladstone finally pulled into the side of a very minor road and yawned. "We seem to have lost them," said Peregrine, who had spent the night peering over the back of the car in the hope of taking a shot at their pursuers. "Not the only thing we've lost," said Gladstone, gloomily looking at the map. "I suppose we can find where we are when we come to the next town. All the same, we're not out of the wood yet." "Aren't we?" said Peregrine, too literally for Gladstone's taste. "I mean, we can see for miles around, and they don't know where we are." Gladstone took out a pipe and lit it. "But they know where we're heading," he said. "And if I were in their shoes, I'd concentrate my forces on the roads leading to the chateau. I mean, I wouldn't waste my time any further afield when it's obvious where we're going." He laid the map out on the grass and knelt beside it. "Now here's the chateau, and as you see, it's devilish conveniently placed. 5 roads lead into Boussat, but only one leads from the village and past the chateau. The drive must come from that road, and by the look of the ground, I'd say it goes up here. But first it has to cross the river, and that means a bridge. That shows they've only to watch the road from Boussat to the north, and Frisson to the south, and guard the bridge to have us neatly in a trap. In short, if we drive there, we're entering a killing ground. And so we won't. Instead, we'll go south on this road here to Floreal. It's about 20 miles away, with empty country in between, and no connecting road to Boussat. If we can find a base somewhere there, we can travel on foot to these heights overlooking the chateau. They may be guarded, but I doubt it. All the same, we'll have to move cautiously and take our time. And now, let's have some breakfast. After that, we'll lie up for the day and get some rest." Peregrine climbed back into the Bentley and fetched the camping gas stove and the picnic hamper, and when they had breakfasted, Gladstone unrolled the sleeping bag. "We'll take it in turns to keep watch," he said, "and remember, if anyone stops, wake me. And stop toying with those damned revolvers. Put them away. The last thing we want is to draw attention to ourselves." While Gladstone lay on the far side of the Bentley and slept, Peregrine kept vigil. But the road was little more than a track, and the country flat and quiet, and nothing passed. Seated on the running board, Peregrine basked in the morning sun and was intensely happy. In the less literal person, the thought might have crossed his mind that his dreams had come true. But Peregrine had accepted dreams as reality from his earliest childhood, and had no such gap to bridge. All the same, he was excited, and endowed the countryside around him with dangers it didn't obviously possess. Unlike Gladstone, whose heroes were romantic and born of nostalgia, Peregrine was more modern. Seated on the running board, he was not Bulldog Drummond and Richard Hannay. He was Bond and the Jackal, a man licensed to kill. Even a cow which peered at him over a gateway seemed to sense its danger and retreated to browse more safely further afield. So the morning passed, with Gladstone snoring in his sleeping bag and Peregrine eyeing the world for lethal opportunities. The afternoon was left to Gladstone. Leaning on the gate and sucking his pipe, he planned his campaign. Once the base was found, they would need enough supplies of food to keep them off the roads and away from towns for several weeks if necessary. He took out a notebook and made a list, and then, deciding that their purchases should be made as far from the chateau as possible, he woke Peregrine, and they drove on to the next town. By the time they left it, the back of the Bentley was filled with tinned food, bottles of Evian water, a comprehensive first aid kit, and a quite extraordinarily long strand of nylon rope. "And now that we're well prepared," said Gladstone, stopping to study the map again, "we'll make a detour so far to the south that no one will suspect our destination. If anyone should ask, we're on a mountaineering holiday in the Pyrenees." "With all these torches and candles, I'd have thought potholing would be more likely," said Peregrine. "Yes, we'd better keep them out of sight. What else? We'll need a good supply of petrol to see us there and out again without using local garages, and that requires 2 jerry cans as a reserve." That night, they took the road again, but this time their route was further east and through wider and more barren country than any they had seen before. By 4 in the morning, Gladstone was satisfied they had come sufficiently far to turn towards the chateau again without risk. "They'll be watching the north-south roads," he said, "but we're coming from the east, and besides, the Floriac road is off the beaten track." It was. As the sun rose behind them, they breasted a hill and looked down into a shallow wooded valley beyond which a panoply of oaks and ancient beeches rose to a crested range before falling again. Gladstone brought the Bentley to a halt and took out the binoculars. But there were no signs of life on the road below them, and no habitation of any sort to be detected among the trees. "Well, now we have our route in and out secure, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a track down there that might prove useful." He let in the clutch, and the Bentley slipped forward almost silently. When they came to the junction, Gladstone stopped. "Go and take a look at that track," he said. "See if it's been used lately and how far it leads into the woods. By my reckoning, it points towards the Chateau Carmagnac." Peregrine got down, crossed the road, and moved through the trees with the silent expertise he had learnt from Major Featherington on the survival course in Wales. He returned with the news that the track was almost overgrown with grass and ended in a clearing. "There's an old sawmill there, but it's all tumbled down and no one has been down there for ages." "How can you tell?" asked Gladstone. "Well, if they have, they didn't use a car," said Peregrine. "There are 2 trees down across the path, and they'll have to move them to get past. It's not difficult because they're not heavy, but I'd swear they've been like that for a couple of years." "Splendid. And what about turning room?" "Oh, plenty up by the sawmill. There's an old lorry rusting outside the place, and you can put the Bentley in a shed behind it." "It sounds as though it'll do for the moment," said Gladstone, and presently the Bentley was stealing up the track. As Peregrine had said, it was overgrown with tall grass, and the 2 fallen trees were light enough to move aside and then replace. By the time they reached the disused sawmill, Gladstone was convinced. An atmosphere of long disuse hung over the crumbling buildings and rusty machinery. "Now that we're here, we'll use the track as seldom as possible, and for the rest we'll move on foot. That's where we'll score. The sort of swine we're up against aren't likely to be used to fieldcraft, and they don't like to leave their cars. Anyway, we came here unobserved, and for the moment they'll be occupied watching the roads for a Bentley. I'd say they'll do that for 2 days, and then they'll start to think again. By that time, we'll have proved the ground and be ready to take action. What that action will be, I don't know, but by nightfall, I want to be in a position to observe the chateau." While Peregrine unloaded the stores from the Bentley and put them in neat piles in what had evidently been the manager's office, Gladstone searched the other buildings and satisfied himself that the place was as deserted as it seemed. But there was nothing to indicate that the sawmill had been visited since it had closed down. Even the windows of the office were unbroken, and a calendar hanging on the wall and portraying a presumably long-dead kitten and a bowl of faded flowers was dated August 1949. "Which suggests," said Gladstone, "that not even the locals come here." Best of all was the large shed behind the ancient lorry. Its corrugated iron doors were rusted on their hinges, but by prizing them apart it was possible to berth the Bentley under cover, and when the doors had been shut, there was nothing to show that the place was inhabited again. "All the same, one of us had better sleep beside the car," said Gladstone, "and from now on we'll carry arms. I doubt if we'll be disturbed, but we're in the enemy's country, and it's foolish to be unprepared." On that sober note, he took his sleeping bag through to the office, while Peregrine settled down beside the Bentley with his revolver gleaming comfortably in a shaft of sunlight that came through a slit in the door. Chapter 12. It was mid-afternoon before Gladstone was prepared to leave for the chateau. "We've got to be ready for every eventuality, and that means leaving nothing to chance," he said. "And if for any reason we're forced to separate, we must each carry enough iron rations to last us a week." "I can see why they're called iron rations," said Peregrine as Gladstone stuffed another 5 cans of corned beef into his rucksack. Gladstone ignored the remark. It was only when he had finished and was trying to lift his own rucksack that its relevance struck him at all forcefully. By then each sack contained 10 cans of assorted food, a flashlight with 2 sets of spare batteries, extra socks and shirts, a Cala gas stove, ammunition for the revolvers, a Swiss Army knife with gadgets for getting stones out of horses' hooves, and, more usefully, opening bottles. On the outside was a sleeping bag and ground sheet, beneath which hung a billy can, a water bottle, a compass, and a map of the area in a plastic cover. Even the pockets were jammed with emergency supplies. In Peregrine's case, 4 bars of chocolate, while Gladstone had a bottle of brandy and several tins of pipe tobacco. "I think that's everything," he said, before remembering the Bentley. He disappeared into the garage and came out 10 minutes later with the sparking plugs. "That should ensure nobody steals her. Not that she's likely to be found, but we can't take risks." "I'm not sure we can take all this lot," said Peregrine, who had only just managed to get his rucksack onto his back and was further burdened by a long coil of nylon rope round his waist. "Nonsense. We may be in the field for some time, and there's no use shirking," said Gladstone, and immediately regretted it. His rucksack was incredibly heavy, and it was only by heaving it onto a rusting oil drum that he was able to hoist the damn thing onto his back. Even then he could hardly walk, but tottered forward, involuntarily propelled by its weight and by the knowledge that he mustn't be the first to shirk. Half an hour later, he was thinking differently, and had twice stopped, ostensibly to take a compass bearing and consult the map. "I'd say we're about 15 miles to the southeast," he said miserably. "At this rate, we'll be lucky to be there before dark." But Peregrine took a more optimistic line. "I can always scout ahead for an easier route. 15 miles isn't really far." Gladstone kept his thoughts to himself. In his opinion, 15 miles, carrying over half a hundredweight of assorted necessities across this diabolically wooded and hilly country, was the equivalent of 50 on the flat, and their failure to find any sort of path, while reassuring in one way, was damnably awkward in another. And Peregrine's evident fitness and the ease with which he climbed steep banks and threaded his way through the forest did nothing to help. Gladstone struggled on, puffing and panting, was scratched and buffeted by branches of trees, and several times had to be helped to his feet. To make matters worse, as the leader of the expedition, he felt unable to complain, and only by staying in front could he at least ensure that Peregrine didn't set the pace. Even that advantage had its drawbacks, in the shape of Peregrine's revolver. "Put that bloody thing away!" Gladstone snapped when he fell for the second time. "All I need now is to be shot in the back." "But I'm only holding it in case we're ambushed. You said we've got to be prepared for anything." "I dare say I did, but since no one knows we're here, and there isn't a semblance of a path, I think we can safely assume that we aren't going to be waylaid," said Gladstone, and struggled to his feet. 20 minutes later, and 400 yards of wooded hillside later, they had reached the top of a ridge and were confronted by a dry and rocky plateau. "The coast de Boussard," said Gladstone again, taking the opportunity to consult the map and sit on a boulder. "Now, if anyone does see us, we've got to pretend we're hikers on a walking tour, and we're heading for Frisson." "But Frisson is over there," said Peregrine, pointing to the south. "I know it is, but we'll make out we've lost our way." "Bit odd, considering we've got maps and compasses," said Peregrine. "Still, if you say so." "I do," said Gladstone grimly, and heaved himself to his feet. For the next hour they trudged across the stony plateau, and Gladstone became increasingly irritable. It was extremely hot, and his feet were beginning to hurt. All the same, he forced himself to keep going, and it was only when they came to a dry gully with steep sides that he decided to revise his tactics. "No good trying to reach the shadow tonight," he said. "And in any case, this looks like a suitable site for a cache of foodstuffs. We'll leave half the tins here. We can always come back for them later on if we need them." And unhitching his rucksack, he slumped it to the ground and began to undo his bootlaces. "I shouldn't do that," said Peregrine. "Why not?" "Major Featherington says you only make your feet swell if you take your boots off on a route march." "Does he?" said Gladstone, who was beginning to resent Major Featherington's constant intrusion, even by proxy. "Well, it so happens all I'm doing is pulling my socks up. They've wrinkled inside the boots, and the last thing I want is to get blisters." For all that, he didn't take his boots off. Instead, he unstrapped the sleeping bag, undid his rucksack, and took out 6 tins. "Right. Now we'll dig a hole and bury the emergency supplies here." While Peregrine quarried a cache in the side of the gully, Gladstone lit his pipe and checked the map again. By his reckoning, they had covered only 6 miles and had another 9 to go. And 9 more miles across this confoundedly stony ground in one day would leave him a cripple. "We'll go on for another hour or two," he said, when Peregrine had finished stowing the tins in the hole and covered them with soil. "Tomorrow morning we'll make an early start and be in a good position to spy out the land round the chateau before anyone's up and about." For 2 hours they tramped on across the coast, encountering nothing more threatening than a few scrawny sheep, one of which Peregrine offered to shoot. "It would save us using any of the tins, and I don't suppose anyone would miss just one sheep," he said. "The Major's always telling us to live off the land." "He wouldn't tell you to go around blasting away at sheep if he were with us now," said Gladstone. "The shot would be heard miles away." "I could always slit its throat," said Peregrine. "No one would hear anything then." "Except a screaming bloody sheep," said Gladstone. "And anyway, it's out of the question. We'd still have to cook it, and the smoke would be spotted." But Peregrine wasn't convinced. "We could roast bits of it over the Calagas stoves, and that way—" "Listen," said Gladstone. "We've come here to rescue the Countess, not to butcher sheep, so let's not waste time arguing about it." Finally, they found a hollow with several thorn trees and bushes in it, and Gladstone called a halt. "We can't be more than 3 miles from the river, and from there we'll be able to view the chateau," he said, as they unrolled their sleeping bags and put a billy can of water on a stove. Above them the evening sky was darkening, and a few stars were visible. They ate some sardines and baked beans and made coffee, and Gladstone, having added brandy to his, began to feel better. "Nothing like the open-air life," he said as he climbed into his sleeping bag and put his dentures into the empty coffee cup. "Hadn't one of us better stay on guard?" asked Peregrine. "I mean, we don't want to be taken unawares." Gladstone groped for his false teeth. "In the first place, no one knows we're here," he said when he'd managed to find them and get them back in his mouth. "And in the second, we've come the devil of a long way, and we're going to need all our strength when we reach the chateau." "Oh, I don't know, we've only come about 12 miles, and that's not all that far. I don't mind taking the first watch, and I can wake you at midnight." "I shouldn't if I were you," said Gladstone, and put his teeth back into the mug. He lay down and tried to make himself comfortable. It wasn't easy. The ground in the hollow was uneven, and he had to sit up again to dislodge several stones that had wedged themselves under his sleeping bag. Even then he was unable to get to sleep, but lay there conscious that his hip seemed to be resting on a small mound. He shifted sideways and finally got it settled, but only at the expense of his right shoulder. He turned over and found his left shoulder on a stone. Once more he sat up and pushed the thing away, upsetting the coffee mug in the process. "Damn," he mumbled, and felt around for his teeth. As he did so, Peregrine, who had been peering suspiciously over the edge of the hollow, slid down towards him. "Don't move another inch," said Gladstone indistinctly. "Why not?" "Because I've mislaid my bloody dentures," Gladstone mumbled, aware that his authority was being eroded by this latest admission of a physical defect, and terrified that Peregrine would step on the damn things. In the end, he found the top plate resting against something that felt suspiciously like sheep droppings. Gladstone shoved it hurriedly back into the mug and made a mental note to wash it carefully in the morning before having breakfast. But the bottom plate was still missing. He reached across for his torch and was about to use it when Peregrine once more demonstrated his superior fieldcraft and his night vision by whispering to him not to turn it on. "Why the devil not?" asked Gladstone. "Because there's something moving around out there. Probably a blasted sheep. Shall I slip out and see? I mean, if it's one of the swine and we capture him, we could make him tell us how to get into the chateau and what's going on there." Gladstone sighed. It was a long, deep sigh, the sigh of a man whose bottom plate was still missing while the other was in all probability impregnated with sheep dung, and who was faced with the need to explain that it was extremely unlikely that one of the swine, a term he regretted having used so freely in the past, was wandering about on a barren plateau at dead of night. "Listen," he hissed through bare gums. "Even if it is one of them, what do you think they're going to think when the, blighter doesn't turn up in the morning? I suppose they might think that we're in the neighbourhood and have got hold of him, and he's told us all he knows. So they'll be doubly on the qui-vive, and on the what? On the lookout, for God's sake. And the whole point of the exercise is that we want to take them by surprise." "I don't see how we can do that," said Peregrine. "After all, they know we're coming. That oil trap in the forest
Told them we're coming by road, not across country. Now shut up and get some sleep."
But Peregrine had slid quietly back up the bank and was peering intently into the night. Gladstone resumed the search for his teeth and finally found them covered in sand. He dropped them into the mug and transferred this to a safer spot inside his rucksack. Then he wormed down into his sleeping bag again and prayed that Peregrine would let him get some rest. But it still took him some time to fall asleep. A lurking feeling that he had made a mistake in bringing Peregrine with him nagged at his mind. He was no longer a young man, and there was something about Peregrine's fitness and his blasted fieldcraft that irritated him. In the morning, he'd have to make it quite clear who was in charge. In fact, it was only an hour or so later when he was woken. The weather had changed, and it had begun to drizzle. Gladstone stared bleakly from his one eye into a grey mist and shivered. He was stiff and cold, and doubly aggravated to see that Peregrine had covered his own sleeping bag with his ground sheet, and pools of water had gathered in the folds. In Gladstone's case it had soaked through the bag itself, and the bottom half felt decidedly damp.
"Staying here any longer and I'll go down with pneumonia,"
he muttered to himself, and, crawling out, put on a jersey, wrapped the ground sheet round his shoulders, and lit the stove. A cup of coffee with a bit of brandy in it would take off the chill. Blearily he filled the billy can with water, and had put his top dentures in his mouth before being reminded by their earthy taste and something else, where they had been. Gladstone spat the things out and rinsed them as best he could. Presently, huddled under the ground sheet, he was sipping coffee and trying to take his mind off his discomfort by planning their strategy when they reached the chateau. It was rather more difficult than he had foreseen. It had been all very well to drive across France, eluding pursuit, but now that they were so close to their goal, he began to see snags. They couldn't very well march up to the front door and ask for the Countess. In some way or other, they would have to let her know they were in the vicinity, and were waiting for her instructions. And this would have to be done without giving the game away to anyone else. The phrase brought him up short. The game away? In the past he had always thought of the great adventure as a game, but now in the cold, wet dawn, squatting in a hollow in a remote part of France, it had a new and rather disturbing reality about it, one involving the genuine possibility of death or torture, and something else almost as alarming. For one brief moment, Gladstone sensed intuitively the unlikelihood that he should have been asked to rescue a countess he had never met from villains occupying her own chateau. But a raindrop dribbling down his nose into his coffee cup put an end to this insight. He was there, in the hollow. He had received her letters, and 2 attempts had been made, at Dover and again in the forest of Dreux, to stop his coming. Those were undeniable facts, and put paid to any doubts about the improbability of the mission. "Can't have this," he muttered, and stood up. Over the edge of the hollow, drifts of light rain shifted across the plateau, obscuring the horizon, and giving the broken terrain the look of no man's land as he had seen it in photographs taken in the Great War. He turned and prodded Peregrine. "Time to be moving," he said, and was horrified to find the barrel of a revolver pointing at him. "Oh, it's you," said Peregrine, who was all too evidently a light sleeper and one who woke instantly. "I thought—" "Never mind what you bloody thought," snapped Gladstone. "Do you have to sleep with that damned gun? I could have been shot." Peregrine scrambled out. "I didn't have it cocked," he said, without any attempt at apology. It was just in case anyone attacked us in the night." "Well, they didn't," said Gladstone. "It would have been a dashed sight more helpful if you'd let me know it was raining. As it was, I got soaked." "But you told me I wasn't to wake you. You said—" "I know what I said, but there's a difference between blathering on about sheep being people and letting me get pneumonia." "Actually, it was a pig," said Peregrine. "When you started snoring, it started moving this way, and I thought I'd better go out and head it off." All right, let's get some breakfast," said Gladstone. "The one good thing about this drizzle is that we'll be able to approach the chateau without being seen, especially if we move off as soon as possible." But getting anywhere near the chateau proved easier said than done. They'd covered a couple of miles when the plateau ended on the edge of a deep ravine whose sides were thick with thorny undergrowth. Gladstone looked over and hesitated. There was no question of fighting their way down it. "I think we'd better head round to the north," he said, but Peregrine was consulting his map. "If I'm right," he said, adopting an expression Gladstone considered his own and consequently resented, "we're too far to the north already. The chateau lies 3 miles south-southwest from here." "What makes you so sure?" said Gladstone, once more feeling that Peregrine was getting the upper hand. "I counted the paces." "The paces? We've come about 3,000 yards, and if we'd been going in the right direction, we should have come to these woods by now." "What woods?" said Gladstone, looking around wearily. "The ones on the map," said Peregrine. "They're marked green, and the river is just beyond them." Gladstone peered at the map and was forced to agree that there were woods opposite the chateau. "Must be something wrong with my compass," he said. "All right, you lead the way, but for God's sake go carefully and don't hurry. We can't afford to take any chance of being spotted now." And having tried to ensure that Peregrine wouldn't march off at some god-awful speed, he plodded along behind him. This time there was no mistake, and an hour later they had entered the woods marked on the map. They sloped away from the plateau and then rose to a ridge. "The river must be on the other side," said Peregrine. "We have only to get to the top, and the chateau will be opposite us." "Only," muttered Gladstone, disentangling his sodden trousers from a bramble bush. But Peregrine was already pushing ahead, weaving his way through the undergrowth with a cat-like stealth and litheness that Gladstone couldn't emulate. Before they had reached the ridge, he had twice had to retrieve his monocle from bushes, and once, when Peregrine suddenly froze and signalled to him to do the same, had stood awkwardly with one foot poised over a pile of twigs. "What the devil are we waiting for?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "I can't stand here like a damned heron on one leg." "I could have sworn I heard something," said Peregrine. "Another bloody sheep, I dare say," muttered Gladstone, but Peregrine was immune to sarcasm. "You don't get sheep in woods. They're ruminants. They eat grass and—" "Have 2 blasted stomachs, I know all that. I didn't come all this way to listen to a lecture on animal physiology. Now get a move on." "But you said—" Gladstone put his foot down to end the discussion, and, shoving past Peregrine, blundered on up the hill. As he crested the rise, he stopped for a moment to get his breath back, only to have it taken away again by the view ahead. Like some holy shrine to which he had at last come, the Chateau Carmagnac stood on a pinnacle of rock 1/2 a mile away across the Gorge du Buz. Even to Gladstone, the chateau exceeded a lifetime's devotion to the unreal. Towers and turrets, topped by spire-like roofs, were clustered around an open courtyard which seemed to overhang the river. An ornate stone balustrade topped the cliff, and to the south, beneath the largest tower, was an archway closed by a massive pair of gates. Then, realizing that he might be seen from its window, he dropped to the turf, and reaching for his binoculars, scanned the place in an ecstasy mixed with anxiety, as if the chateau was some mirage which might at any moment disappear. But the glasses only magnified his joy. Everything about the chateau was perfect. Window boxes of geraniums hung from the first floor, as did a stone balcony, a tiny belvedere perched on a slim promontory above the cliff. Orange trees in tubs stood on either side of the steps leading down from doors set in a round tower, whose walls were pierced at intervals to indicate the passage of a staircase that circled up it. In short, all was as Gladstone would have had it. And, as he looked, the sun broke through the clouds, and the spires and the flagstones of the courtyard gleamed silver in its light. Gladstone put down the binoculars and studied the surrounding landscape. It was rather unpleasantly at odds with the chateau itself, and while the latter had a festive air about it, the same couldn't be said for its environs. To put it bluntly, the country was as bleak and barren as the chateau was ornamental. A few rather desiccated walnut trees had been planted and presumably irrigated ever since to provide an avenue for the portion of the drive closest to the main gates, but for the rest, the chateau was surrounded by open ground which afforded no cover. And the drive itself was formidable. Cut into the rock to the south of the chateau, it writhed its way up the cliff in a series of extraordinary bends, which suggested a truly maniacal desire for the spectacular on the part of its designer. Finally, to make the approach by road still more secure, a wooden bridge without a guardrail spanned the river. "Dashed cunning," Gladstone muttered. "There's no way of crossing that bridge without signalling your coming." As if to prove the truth of this observation, a van turned off the road below them and rattled slowly across the planks before grinding its way in bottom gear up the quarried drive. Gladstone watched it reach the walnut trees and disappear round the corner of the chateau. Then he turned hopefully to the north in search of an easier way up. True, the slope was less perpendicular than the cliff, but the few stunted thorn trees managing to grow among the rocks afforded little cover, and the rocks themselves seemed untrustworthy to judge by the number that had rolled down and now formed a barrier along the riverbank. Last, but by no means least in the list of natural hazards, was the river itself. It swirled round the base of the cliff with a dark and malevolent turbulence that suggested it was both deep and subject to dangerous currents. "Well, we've had a preliminary look at the place," he told Peregrine. "What we need now is to establish a base camp out of sight and get something warm inside us while we consider the next move." They crawled back off the ridge and found a suitable space among the bracken. There, while Peregrine heated up some baked beans on the stove, Gladstone sat on his rucksack, sucking his pipe, and pondered what to do. Chapter 13. For the rest of the day, Gladstone lay in the sun, drying himself out and keeping a close watch on the chateau. "They're bound to have some system for watching the roads," he told Peregrine, "and for signalling when someone suspicious puts in an appearance, and once we find out what that is, we can bypass it." "Yes, but we're not on the road," said Peregrine. "I should have thought the simplest thing would be to swim the river and shin up the cliff." "What's the matter?" "Nothing," said Gladstone when he could bring himself to speak. "And when do you propose we do this? In the broad bloody daylight?" "Oh, no, we'd have to do it after dark." Gladstone gnawed on the stem of his pipe and tried to control himself. "Listen," he said finally, "if you're seriously suggesting that we try to climb what amounts to the north face of the Eiger on a miniature scale in pitch darkness, you must have less between the ears than I thought you had. We've come here to save the Countess, not to commit bloody suicide. Why do you think the chateau is walled on 3 sides, but there's only a balustrade above the river?" Peregrine considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't suppose it's very safe to build a high wall on top of a cliff," he said. "I mean, you never know with cliffs, do you? I've an auntie in Dorset, and she's got a bungalow near some cliffs, and she can't sell it because some of the other bungalows are slipping over, and—" "To hell with your blasted aunt," said Gladstone, savaging a can of corned beef with a tin opener. "The reason there's no wall on this side is because they don't have to protect it. Only a blithering idiot would try to scale that precipice." "Clive did," said Peregrine, unabashed. "Clive? What on earth are you talking about now?" "When he captured Quebec, he sailed his—" "Wolf, for God's sake, can't you get anything right? "Oh, all right, Wolf, then. I never was much good at history." "So I've noticed," said Gladstone, skewering bits of corned beef into the billy can. But Peregrine hadn't finished. "Anyway, it's not really a cliff, and we wouldn't have to start at the bottom. There's a ledge near the top, and we could get onto it from the drive." "Which they've left unguarded just to make things easier for us, I suppose," said Gladstone. "We could always make our way round to the south and climb up there," Peregrine continued. "That way we'd be coming down the drive from the top instead of the other way round. They'd never expect us to do that." "I'll grant you that," said Gladstone, absent-mindedly putting the billy can on the Cala gas stove and lighting it. "And if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't expect anyone to do such an asinine thing either." "Then once we're on that ledge—" He stopped and stared at the smoking billy can. "I say, I've never seen corned beef cooked like that before. Shouldn't you stir it round a bit?" Gladstone wrenched the pan off the stove and burnt his hand in the process. "Now look what you made me do," he said lividly. "I didn't make you do it," said Peregrine. "All I said was, 'Once we were on that bloody ledge,' that's what you said. Well, let's get something straight. We're not going anywhere near that ledge. That cliff is unclimbable, and there's an end to the matter." "What I meant was, I didn't tell you to fry the corned beef like that. Major Featherington always taught us to put cans in hot water and heat them that way. You open them first, of course, otherwise they might explode." "And doubtless he also taught you to climb cliffs in the middle of the fucking night, too," said Gladstone, resorting to foul language as a safety valve against exploding himself. "Well, actually, yes," said Peregrine. "Mind you, we used tampons." "You used what?" demanded Gladstone, momentarily diverted from his burnt hand by the extraordinary vision this conjured up. "Steel things you hammer into the rock," said Peregrine. "For your information, they're called crampons, otherwise known as climbing irons. That's not what the Major calls them. He said always to call them tampons, because if you didn't ram them into some bleeding crack really tight, you'd end up looking like a jam rag yourself. I don't know what he meant by that." "I do," said Gladstone miserably. These revelations of the Major's revolting teaching methods were having an adverse effect on his morale. He'd come on an adventure to rescue a noble lady, and already the idyll was turning into an unnerving and sordid experience. To get some temporary relief, he told Peregrine to shut up, crawled back to the lookout, and went through the notes he'd made on the occupants of the chateau as he had observed them during the day in an attempt to discern some sinister pattern to their movements. The van he had seen drive up at 7 a.m. had left 20 minutes later. At 8, a young man in a tracksuit had come out onto the terrace, had run round it 38 times, and then touched his toes 50 times, done 22 press-ups, had lain on his back and raised his feet in the air too erratically for Gladstone to keep count, and had finally wandered exhaustedly back to the door in the round tower on the right, under the watchful eye of a portly woman in a floral dressing gown who had appeared on the balcony above. Gladstone had switched his own observations to her, but she had disappeared before he could deduce anything very sinister from her appearance, except that she seemed to be wearing hair curlers. At 8:30, an old man with a watering can had ambled from the gate tower and had made some pretence of watering small flower beds, which, considering the rain there had been through the night, Gladstone found distinctly suspicious. But it was only at 10 that Gladstone's interest was genuinely aroused. A group of men came out onto the terrace, engaged in heated argument. They were joined presently by the woman he had seen on the balcony. Training the binoculars on her, he hoped she wasn't the Countess. His image of her had been more petite and vulnerable. On the other hand, the men lived up to his expectations. "That's as unpleasant a bunch as I've seen in a long while," he told Peregrine, handing him the binoculars. "Take a good look at the bald-headed bastard with the moustache and the correspondent shoes." "The what?" The two-tone shoes. It's my guess he's the leader of the gang. He seems to be having a row with a swine in a grey suit, probably because they lost us on the road. I wouldn't like to cross his path." Peregrine thought this over. "But we're bound to," he said at last. "That's what we've come for, isn't it?" "Yes," said Gladstone. "Yes, it is. I just meant... Oh, never mind. I'm just pointing him out as a particularly nasty piece of goods." "It's a pity we didn't bring a rifle," said Peregrine a few minutes later. "I could have picked a couple of them off from here with no trouble." "Doubtless. And given our position away into the bargain. For goodness sake, try to understand we mustn't do anything to put the Countess's life in danger. When we strike, we're only going to get the one chance. Miss it, and she's done for." "I'd have done for some of them too. Anyway, I don't miss." "Thank God we didn't bring a rifle," said Gladstone. "And now let's go and have some lunch. They're going in, and I'm feeling peckish myself." They crawled back to the dell and settled down to a meal of stale French bread and overripe camembert, washed down with vin très ordinaire. "You'd think they'd have some sentries posted," said Peregrine as Gladstone lit his pipe. "No doubt they have, but not here. They'll be on the roads or on the far side of the chateau. It's nice and flat over there, and it's the direction they'd expect an attack to come from." "I wouldn't. I don't want to know," said Gladstone. "I'm going to take a kip and advise you to do the same. We've got a long ride ahead of us." He climbed into the sunlight and lay looking up at a cloudless sky. If it hadn't been for Peregrine's lust for action, and preferably for killing people at the drop of a hat, he'd have been perfectly happy. He'd have to keep him under control. With this thought in mind, he drifted off to sleep. But when he awoke, it was to find Peregrine squinting up the barrel of a revolver. "It's nice and clean, and I've oiled them both." Gladstone asserted his authority. "Look," he said, "tonight's expedition is simply a recce. It's highly unlikely we're going to find an easy way in. We're going to check every avenue. Yes, I know there's only one fucking avenue of walnut trees. Just keep your trap shut and listen. We're going to see how many ways there are of getting into the place. And only when we've worked out a definite and foolproof plan will we act. Get that clear in your head." "If you say so," said Peregrine. "All the same, I'd have thought that I am not interested in what you think. I am in charge, and those are my orders." And without waiting for an answer, Gladstone went back to the lookout. "That ought to keep the stupid bastard quiet," he thought. It did. Later that night they set out. Peregrine was grimly silent. "We're going upriver," Gladstone told him. "I have an idea. We'll find some shallows there." Peregrine said nothing, but when half an hour later they scrambled down the hillside and crossed the road to the water's edge, it was obvious that Gladstone had been mistaken. The booze ran darkly past and curved away towards the cliff at the top of which the chateau loomed weirdly against the starlit sky. Not even Gladstone's imagination could endow the place with anything more romantic than grim menace, and when a car swept round a bend in the road above them, its headlights briefly illuminating the river, he was frankly shocked. Dark swirls of water indicated that the booze was both deep and fast-flowing. "Well, at least one thing's clear," he said. "We now know why they're not watching this side. It's too well protected. The river sees to that." Beside him, Peregrine merely grunted. "Now what's that supposed to mean?" asked Gladstone. "You told me to keep my trap shut and just listen," said Peregrine. "Those were your orders, and that's what I'm doing." "And I suppose you don't agree with me," said Gladstone. "About what?" "That it's impossible to get across here," said Gladstone, and immediately regretted it. "I could swim across easily enough, if that's what you mean." "It's not a risk I'm prepared to allow you to take. We'll have to try further on." But though they stumbled along the bank for half a mile, the river grew wider and less inviting. Gladstone had to admit defeat. "We'll just have to look for another route downstream in daylight tomorrow," he said. "I don't see why you won't let me swim across with the rope," said Peregrine. "I could tie it to something on the other side, and you could haul yourself over on it." "And what about the guns and the equipment in the rucksacks? They get soaked." "Not necessarily. Once you're over, I can come back and get them. The Major—" But Gladstone had had enough of Major Featherington's methods. "If you get across—" "I shall," said Peregrine, and taking the coil of rope and winding it round his waist, he waded into the river. Left to himself, Gladstone sat disconsolately in the darkness. To conjure up some courage, he concentrated his thoughts on the Countess. She had warned him that the affair would be hazardous, and she had obviously been telling the truth. On the other hand, she had taken a terrible risk herself in writing to him. Above all, she had appealed to him as a gentleman, and gentlemen didn't flinch in the face of a mere river. After all, his father had fought at Jutland, and a maternal great-uncle had assisted in the bombardment of Alexandria in 1881. There had even been a midshipman Gladstone at Trafalgar. With such a nautical tradition in the family, he couldn't fail in his duty now. And in any case, it would never do to show the slightest fear in front of Peregrine. The brute was cocky enough as it was. All the same, he was decidedly disappointed when Peregrine returned with the news that there was nothing to it. "A bit of a current, that's all, but it's all right if you swim upstream, and anyway you'll have the rope." Gladstone took off his boots and, tying the laces together, looped them across his shoulder. The main thing was to act quickly and not to think. Even so, he hesitated as he took hold of the wet rope. "You're absolutely certain you saw nothing suspicious over there? The last thing we want is to walk into a trap." "I didn't see anything except rocks and things, and anyway, you said they're not watching this side because—" "I know what I said. You don't have to keep repeating it all the time. Now, as soon as I'm over, I'll give a tug on the rope as a signal. Have you got that straight?" "Yes," said Peregrine, "but shouldn't I get the rope taut and tied to something?" Gladstone didn't hear him. He had already plunged into the river and was experiencing to the full what Peregrine had described as a bit of a current. To Gladstone's way of thinking, not that he had much opportunity for thought, the lout didn't know a current from a maelstrom. And as for swimming upstream, desperately fighting to keep his head above water and failing, tying his boots round his neck had been a ghastly mistake. The bloody things had filled with water and acted as sinkers. Holding his breath when he went under and spouting when he came up, Gladstone clung to the rope for dear life and was swept downstream at a rate of knots. Only the rope saved him, and just as he knew he was drowning, he banged into a rock, found himself bobbing in some slightly less turbulent water, and his feet touched ground. For a moment he lay there, before scrambling up onto a rock ledge. It was still below water, but it served as a seat, and when the water had drained from his eye, he saw that he was at the base of the cliff. He hadn't much use for cliffs, but in the circumstances they were infinitely preferable to the swirling river. Gladstone edged himself away from it and stood up. As he did so, he gave a tug on the rope. Upstream, Peregrine responded. He'd been having some difficulty getting his hands on the cord in the darkness, but had finally found it. And now came the signal that Gladstone was safely across. Peregrine dragged on the rope. So for a moment did Gladstone, but the imminent prospect of being hauled back into that infernal torrent, combined with his inability to stand upright on the slimy rock, proved too much for him. With a groan, he slumped down and let go. He knew now with a terrible certainty that he should never have brought Peregrine. "The bloody moron!" he muttered, before realizing that his only hope lay in the moron realizing what had happened. It was a faint hope, but he clung to it as desperately as he did to the rock. As usual, he was wrong. Peregrine was busy devising a method of carrying the guns and rucksacks across without getting them wet. On their way up the river, he had noticed what looked like a rubbish tip. Worming his way along the bank, he made a number of other interesting discoveries, among them an ancient bedstead, a rotted garden frame, several plastic sacks filled with garbage, something that felt and smelt like a dead dog, and finally an old oil drum. This was just what he needed. He dragged it back and was about to put the rucksacks in it when it dawned on him that it wouldn't float upright unless weighted down. After searching around for some rocks, he climbed back to the road and brought down a painted concrete block which marked the verge. He dumped it in and, tying the drum to the rope, let it out. The thing stayed upright. Only then did he put the guns and rucksacks in and, wedging the thing against the bank, undid the rope from the tree. 5 minutes later, he was on the opposite bank. "I've got everything ready to pull across," he whispered. There was no reply. Crouching down, he stared up the rocky hillside and was wondering where Gladstone had got to, when something moved, and a boulder rolled down to his left, followed by a cascade of small stones. Evidently Gladstone had gone ahead to wreck him, and as usual was making a bad job of it. Presumably he'd be back in a minute or two, and in the meantime the equipment had to be brought across. Setting his back against the slope and bracing his feet against a large rock, Peregrine grasped the rope and began to haul. For a moment the oil drum seemed to resist his efforts, and then, with a surge, it was out into the main stream and swirling away almost as fast as Gladstone. Certainly it followed the same course, and Gladstone, who had just taken his sodden pipe out and was sucking it morosely, was suddenly aware that a new and possibly more dangerous element than the river itself had entered his limited domain. With a metallic thud, the drum slammed into the rock he was crouching on, and it was only by throwing himself to one side that he avoided having his legs crushed. Then, as he glared at this latest threat, the thing moved away upstream, leaving him to ponder on its purpose. Clearly, whatever it was that had attempted to kill him couldn't be making headway against the current unless it was being pulled. Gladstone got the message, but it was too late to grab the drum. In any case, the notion that Peregrine's idea of trying to rescue him consisted of letting heavy metal objects batter the ledge he was on suggested that the lout was insane. Standing well back against the cliff, he waited for the next attempt. It never came. Having pulled the drum up the bank, Peregrine hurriedly unloaded it, untied the rope, and stowed it on the rocks. Only then did he begin to wonder what to do next. If Gladstone had gone ahead, he would presumably come back or send a signal for Peregrine to join him. But as the minutes went by and nothing happened, a new and more ominous thought came to mind. Perhaps Gladstone had walked into a trap. He'd said they wouldn't be watching this side of the chateau because it was too well protected, but that was just the opposite of what Major Featherington had taught. "Remember this," he had said. "The one place you don't expect the enemy to attack is the one they'll choose. The secret of strategy is to do what your opponent least expects." But Gladstone hadn't seen it that way. On the other hand, why hadn't they waited to capture him too? Again Peregrine found an easy answer. The swine had thought Gladstone was on his own and didn't know that there were two of them. Besides, his fieldcraft was hopeless, and you could hear him coming a mile off, and he'd definitely got across because there had been that tug on the rope. With all the stealth of a dangerous predator, Peregrine put the coil over his shoulder, stuffed one revolver in his belt, cocked the other one, and began the slow ascent of the hillside. Every few yards he stopped and listened, but apart from a goat that scurried off across the rocks, he heard and saw nothing suspicious. At the end of 20 minutes he had reached the top and was standing in the dry moat under the walls of the chateau itself. To his left was the cliff, while to his right was a corner tower. For a moment he hesitated. The notion of climbing in by way of the cliff still appealed to him, but it was too easy now. He was about to move round the tower when he found what he wanted to make a genuinely dangerous entry. A metal strip ran down the wall of the tower, a lightning conductor. Shoving his hands behind it, he pulled, but the copper strip held. 5 minutes later he had reached the top of the tower and was on the roof. He crawled forward and peered down into the courtyard. It was empty, but a few windows on the first floor were still alight, and opposite him, under the archway that led to the main gates, a lamp shone down on the cobbles. That put paid to his idea of letting himself down on the rope. He'd be seen too easily. He got up and moved across the roof towards the tower, and saw a square, box-shaped trap protruding from the lead. Kneeling down beside it, he eased the top up and peered down into the darkness. It was obviously a means of access to the roof, but what was below? Shoving it still further over, he lay down and put his head through the opening. Silence. Nothing stirred below, and after listening carefully, he took out his torch and flashed it briefly down. He was looking into a corridor, but best of all, some metal rungs were set into the wall. Peregrine switched off the flashlight, swung his legs over the edge, and, hanging onto the top rung, eased the cover back over the trap. Then he climbed down, and moving with the utmost caution, crept along the passage to a door at the end. Again he waited with every sense alert for danger, but the place was silent. He opened the door, and by the light shining through a slit window, found himself at the head of a curved turret staircase. Keeping close to the outer wall, he went down until he came to another door. Still silence. He opened it a fraction and saw a long corridor at the end of which a light was shining on a landing. Peregrine closed the door and went on down. If Gladstone was imprisoned anywhere, it would be in an underground cell. Perhaps the Countess would be there too. Anyway, it was the first place to look. Peregrine reached the ground floor and, ignoring the door into the courtyard, followed the steps down below ground. Here everything was pitch dark, and after taking the precaution of waiting and listening again, he switched on his torch. The base of the turret had brought him to the junction of two tunnels. One led off to his right under the east wing, while the other disappeared into the distance below the main body of the chateau. Peregrine chose the latter, and was halfway along it, when through an open doorway on one side he heard the murmur of voices. That they didn't come from the room itself was obvious. It was rather that people in the room above could be heard down there. He flashed his torch briefly, and saw that the place had once been a kitchen. An old black iron range stood in the chimney breast, and in the middle of the room a large wooden table stood covered with dust. Beyond it was a large stone sink, and a window and a door which led out into a sunken area. To one side of the sink, a chain hung down over the walled lip of what seemed to be a well. A wooden lid covered it now. Peregrine crossed the room, lifted the lid, and shone the torch down, and very faintly saw, far below, its reflected light. It might come in handy for a hiding place in an emergency, but in the meantime he was more interested in the voices. The sound of them came, he realized, from what looked like a small lift shaft set into the wall at the far end of the kitchen. Peregrine switched off his torch and stuck his head through the opening. Two men in the room above were engaged in heated argument. "You're not reading me, Hans," said an American. "You're taking a non-power-oriented standpoint. Now, what I'm saying is that from the proven experimental evidence of the past, there is no alternative to realpolitik, or Machtpolitik, if you like." "I don't like," said a man with a foreign accent. "And I should know. I was there at the Battle of the Kursk. You think I liked that?" Sure, I guess not. But what happened there was the breakdown of Machtpolitik, power-wise." "You can say that again," said the German. "You know how many tigers we lost?" "Jesus, I'm not talking logistically. You had a pre-war situation which was unbalanced. We had a man who was unbalanced too. That's what you fail to take into account. The human psyche. All you can see is the material, the non-personalistic and dehumanized product of an economically dependent species. But never psychical impulses which transcend the material. That is not true. I admit the interdependency of the individual and the socio-economic environment, but the basis remains the same. The person is the process." The German laughed. "You know, when I hear you talk that way, I'm reminded of our Soviet colleague. The individual is free by virtue of the very collectivity which makes him unfree. With you, the collective imposes a freedom on the individual which he does not want. In the Soviet case, there is the stasis of state capitalism, and in the American, the chaos of the free market economy. And in both, the individual is tied with the halter of militaristic power monopolies over which he has no control. And that you rationalize as realpolitik. And without it, you wouldn't be sitting here, Heine," said the American savagely. "Professor Botwick," said the German, "I would remind you that we neither of us would be sitting here if 20 million Russians hadn't died. I would ask you to remember that also. And so good night." He left the room, and for a while Peregrine could hear the other man pacing the room above. He had understood nothing of what they'd been talking about except that it had been something to do with the war. Presently the American moved out of the room. Below him in the passage Peregrine followed the sound of his footsteps. Halfway along the passage they turned away. Peregrine stopped and flashed his torch briefly. Some steps led up to a door. Very cautiously he climbed them and softly opened the door. A figure was standing on the terrace and had lit a cigar. As Peregrine watched, he walked away. Peregrine slipped after him. Here was the perfect opportunity to learn what had happened to Gladstone. As the man stood staring contemplatively over the valley, puffing his cigar, Peregrine struck. To be precise, he sprang and locked one arm round his victim's throat, while with the other he twisted his arm behind his back. For a second the cigar glowed and then grew dim. "One word out of you and you'll die," whispered Peregrine gratuitously. With rather more smoke in his lungs than he was in the habit of inhaling, and with what felt like a hangman's noose in human form round his neck, the advocate of Machtpolitik was for once speechless. For a moment he writhed, but Peregrine's grip tightened. "What have you done with him?" he demanded when the struggling stopped. The American's only answer was a spasm of coughing. "You can cut that out too," continued Peregrine, and promptly made the injunction entirely unnecessary. "You're going to tell me where you've put him." "Put who, for Christ's sake?" gasped the professor when he was allowed to breathe again. "You know, I swear." "I shouldn't if I were you. But who are you talking about?" "Gladstone," whispered Peregrine. "Mr. Gladstone." "Mr. Gladstone?" gurgled the professor, whose ears were now buzzing from lack of oxygen. "You want me to tell you where Mr. Gladstone is?" Peregrine nodded. "But he's been dead since—" He got no further. The confirmation that Gladstone had been murdered was all Peregrine needed. With his arm clamped across Professor Botwick's windpipe, he shoved him against the balustrade. For a moment the professor fought to break loose, but it was no use. As he lost consciousness he was vaguely aware that he was falling. It was preferable to being strangled. Peregrine watched him drop without interest. Gladstone was dead. One of the swine had paid for it, but there was still the Countess to consider. With his mind filled with terrible clichés, Peregrine turned back towards the chateau. Chapter 14. For the next hour, the occupants of the Chateau Carmagnac were subjected to some of the horrors of Peregrine's literary education. The fact that they were a strange mixture of British holiday-makers who had answered advertisements in The Lady offering a quiet holiday au chateau, and a small group of self-styled international thinkers sponsored by intensely nationalistic governments to attend a symposium on détente or destruction, added to the consequent misunderstanding. The Countess's absence didn't help either. "Haven't the foggiest, old chap," said Mr. Hodgson, a scrap-iron merchant from Huddersfield, whom Peregrine had caught in the corridor trying to find the light switch. "You wouldn't happen to know where the loo is, would you?" Peregrine jabbed him in the paunch with his revolver. "I'm not asking again. Where's the Countess?" "Look, old chap, if I knew, I'd tell you. As I don't, I can't. All I'm interested in now is having a slash." Peregrine gave him one, and stepping over his body, went in search of someone more informative. He found Dmitri Apnikov. "No capitalist, no rubles, no nothing," he said, taking hurriedly to broken English instead of his normally fluent American, in the hope that this would identify him more readily on the side of whatever oppressed masses Peregrine's antisocial action might be said to express. In his pyjamas he felt particularly vulnerable. "I want the Countess," said Peregrine. Countess, I know nothing. Countess aristocratic scum should be abolished, like in my country. Yes?" "No," said Peregrine. "You're going to tell me where—" Dr. Apnikov wasn't. He broke into a spate of Russian and was rewarded by one of Major Featherington's specials, which left him unable to say anything. Peregrine switched out the light and hurried from the room. Outside, he encountered Signor Badiglione, a Catholic Euro-communist who knew enough about terrorism to have the good sense to hurl himself through the nearest door and lock it behind him. That it happened to be the door to the room of Dr. Hildegard Keister, a Danish expert on surgical therapy for sexual offenders, and that she was cutting her toenails with a pair of scissors and exposing a good deal of thigh in the process, rendered Signor Badiglione totally incoherent. "You want me? Yes?" asked the doctor in Danish, advancing on him with a Scandinavian broad-mindedness Signor Badiglione entirely misinterpreted. Babbling frantic apologies, he tried to unlock the door, but the good doctor was already upon him. "Terrorist outside!" he squealed. "The reciprocated sensuality is natural," said the doctor, and dragged him back to the bed. Further down the corridor, Peregrine was engaged in an attempted dialogue with Pastor Laudenbach, the German who had been through the Battle of the Kursk salient and whose pacifism was consequently sufficiently earnest for him to refuse to give in to Peregrine's threat to blow his head off if he didn't stop saying his prayers and tell him where the Countess was. In the end, the pastor's convictions prevailed and Peregrine left him unscathed. He was even less successful with his next victim, Professor Zukash, an economist of such austere Marxist-Leninist theoretical principles that he'd spent a great many years in Hungarian prisons to save the country's industrial progress, and who had been sent to the conference in the vain hope that he would defect, was too used to young men with guns patrolling corridors to be in the least disconcerted. "I help you find her," he told Peregrine. "My father was with Bela Kun in the First Revolution, and he shot countesses. But not enough, you understand. The same now. The bourgeoisification of the masses is detrimental to the proletarian consciousness. It is only by—" They were interrupted by the Mexican delegate who poked his head round the door of his bedroom and expressed the wish that they would shoot countesses somewhere else, and said that he had enough trouble with insomnia without having proletarian consciousnesses added to it. "Trotskyite!" snapped Professor Zukash. "Imperialist lackey!" In the ensuing row, Peregrine made his escape. Even to his limited intellect, it was obvious that the Countess wasn't in this wing of the chateau. He hurried along the corridor and found a passage to the right. He was just wondering which room to enter when the matter was decided for him. Someone was moaning nearby. Peregrine moved towards the sound and stopped outside a door. The moaning was quite distinct now. So was the creak of bed springs. Peregrine had no difficulty interpreting them. Someone who had been gagged and tied to a bed was struggling to escape. He knew who that someone was. Very gently he tried the handle of the door and was surprised to find it opened. The room was as dark as the passage, and the sounds were even more heartrending. The Countess was obviously in agony. She was panting and moaning, and the depth of her despair was rendered more poignant by the occasional grunt. Peregrine edged silently towards the bed and reached out a hand. An instant later he had withdrawn it. Whatever other physical peculiarities the Countess might have, one thing was certain: she had a remarkably hairy and muscular behind. She was also stark naked. Anyway, she had got the message that help was on the way. She had stopped bouncing on the bed, and Peregrine was about to explain that he'd have her out of here in a jiffy when she moaned again and spoke. "More! More! Why have you stopped? I was just coming!" It was on the tip of Peregrine's tongue to say that she didn't have to because he was there and would untie her, when a man's voice answered. "How many hands have you got?" he asked. "Hands? Hands? How many hands? Is that what you said?" "That's exactly it." "That's what I thought," muttered the woman. "At a time like this, you've got to ask fool questions. How the hell many hands do you think I got? 3? "Yes," said the man. "And one of them is cold and horny." "Jeepers! Horny! Only one thing round here that's horny has got to be you. I should know. So come on, honey, lay off the gags and give it to me." "All right," said the man doubtfully. "All the same, I could have sworn—" "Don't be crazy, lover. Get on with it." The bouncing began again, though this time it was accompanied by rather less enthusiastic grunts from the man and by frantic requests for more from the woman. Crouching in the darkness by the bed, Peregrine dimly understood that for the first time in his life he was in the presence of a sexual act. He wondered what to do. The only thing he was sure of was that this couldn't be the Countess. Countesses didn't writhe and moan on beds with hairy men bouncing on top of them. All the same, he was interested to see what they were doing, but he couldn't stay there when the Countess's life was at stake. He was just getting up when the mat on the floor slid away from him. To stop himself from falling, Peregrine reached out and this time grasped the woman's raised knee. A strangled yell came from the bed and the bouncing stopped. Peregrine let go hurriedly and tiptoed to the door. "What's the matter?" asked the man. "Hands?" gasped the woman. "Did you say hands?" "I said one hand. I believe you. It just grabbed my knee." "Well, it wasn't mine." I know that. Where's the light switch? Get the light switch! As her voice rose hysterically, Peregrine groped for the door handle and knocked over a vase. The sound of breaking china added to the din. "Let me go!" shrieked the woman. "I gotta get out of here! There's something awful in the room! Oh my God! Someone do something!" Peregrine did. He wasn't waiting around while she screamed blue murder. He found the door and shot into the corridor. Behind him, the woman's screams had been joined by those of her lover. "How the hell can I do anything if you won't let me go?" he bawled. "Help!" yelled the woman. As doors along the passage opened and lights came on, Peregrine disappeared round the corner and was hurtling down a large marble staircase towards the faint light illuminating the open doorway when he collided with the British delegate, Sir Arnold Brymay, who had been trying to think of some rational argument to the assertions of all the other delegates that Britain's colonial role in Ulster was as detrimental to world peace as the Middle East question, US involvement in South America, and Russia's in Afghanistan and Poland, about which topics there was no such agreement. Since his expertise was in tropical medicine, he hadn't come up with an answer. "What on earth?" he began as Peregrine ran into him, but this time Peregrine was determined to get a straight answer. "See this?" he said, jamming the revolver under Sir Arnold's nose with a ferocity that left no doubt what it was. "Well, one sound out of you, and I'm going to pull the trigger. Now, where's the Countess?" "You tell me not to utter a sound, and then you ask me a question. How do you expect me to answer?" asked Sir Arnold, who hadn't been debating the Irish question for nothing. "Shut up," said Peregrine, and forced him through the nearest doorway and shut the door. "Any funny tricks and your brains will be all over the ceiling. Now, look here, if you'd kindly remove that firearm from my left nostril, we might be able to get down to the agenda," said Sir Arnold, jumping to the natural conclusion that he was either dealing with one of the other delegates who'd gone clean off his head, or more probably with the IRA. "I said, where's the Countess?" growled Peregrine. "What Countess?" "You know. If you don't answer, it's curtains." "It rather sounds like it," said Sir Arnold, buying time. Upstairs, a fresh problem had obviously arisen. "Let me out!" bawled the erstwhile lover. "I can't!" screamed the woman. "I'm all tensed up!" "As if I didn't know! And stop pulling my legs, you bastards! You want me to be disemboweled or something? Can't you see I'm dark-knotted?" "Dear God," said Sir Arnold, "this is terrible." "Answer the question." "Well, it rather depends on which Countess you mean." "The Countess of Montcalm." "Really? An unusually revealing name, and one that by the sound of things upstairs that young man would have found infinitely more inviting, don't you think?" "Right," said Peregrine. "You've asked for it, and you're going to get it." And shoving Sir Arnold against the wall, he aimed the revolver at him with both hands. All right. As a matter of fact, she's not here," said the expert on bilharzia, deciding that, while he hadn't asked for anything, the time had come to invent something in preference for being shot. "She's at Antibes." "And where's she live, this aunt?" asked Peregrine. "Live?" said Sir Arnold, his sang-froid crumbling under this line of questioning and the discussion going on above. Some voluble woman who claimed to know all about dog-knotting from personal experience with her bull-terriers had just tried throwing a bucket of cold water over the loving couple with predictably aggravating results. "Shit!" yelled the young man. "Get it into your stupid head! I'm not a fucking bull-terrier! Do that again, I'll be clamped in a corpse!" Sir Arnold dragged his attention away from this academic question and faced up to his imminent death. Peregrine had begun the countdown. "Antibes is a place, for God's sake," he said, beginning to gibber. "I know that, but where?" demanded Peregrine. "Near Saint-Tropez." "And what's the address?" "What address?" "Antibes." But the strain of being held at gunpoint by a maniac who thought that Antibes was a person, while a couple who claimed they weren't bull-terriers were being drowned upstairs, was proving too much for Sir Ronald. "I can't stand it! I can't stand it!" he gibbered, and proved his point by slumping down the wall. For a moment, Peregrine hesitated. He was tempted to kick some life into the swine, but the sound of footsteps and someone talking excitedly in the hall deterred him. Besides, he was fairly sure now that the Countess wasn't in the chateau, and there was no point in risking capture. Opening a window, he checked that the courtyard was clear and then jumped lightly across the flower bed. 5 minutes later, he had reached the roof and was scrambling down the lightning conductor with a lack of vertigo that would have appalled Gladstone. Not that Gladstone needed appalling. Ever since he had scrambled onto the ledge at the bottom of the cliff, he had come to feel differently about adventures. They were not the splendid affairs he'd read about. Quite the contrary. They were bloody nightmares in which one stumbled across miles of foul countryside carrying an overweight rucksack, spent sleepless nights shivering with cold in the rain, ate burnt corned beef out of tins, learned what it felt like to be drowned, and ended up soaked to the skin on rock ledges from which the only escape had to be by drowning. Having experienced the boozy's horrid habit of sucking things down like some torrential lavatory pan, he knew he'd never be able to swim across. On the other hand, there was little enough to be said for staying where he was. The simile of the lavatory didn't apply there. It was literal. The chateau's sewage system was extremely primitive, and, in Gladstone's opinion, typically French. Everything it carried issued from some encrusted pipe in the cliff above and was discharged into the river. In practice, a good deal of it landed on Gladstone, and he was just wondering if it wouldn't be preferable to risk drowning than be treated as a human cesspit, when he became aware that something more substantial was bouncing down the cliff. For a moment it seemed to hang on the pipe and then slid forward out into the river. With the demented thought that this would teach Peregrine not to be such a stupid idiot as to climb cliffs in the middle of the night, Gladstone reached for the body and dragged it onto the ledge. Then he groped for its mouth and already had given it the kiss of life for half a minute before it occurred to him that there were one or two discrepancies between whatever he was trying to resuscitate and Peregrine. Certainly Peregrine didn't have a moustache and wasn't entirely bald, added to which it seemed unlikely that he had suddenly developed a taste for brandy and cigars. For a moment or two Gladstone stopped before his sense of duty forced him to carry on. He couldn't let the bastard die without doing anything. Besides, he began to have a horrid suspicion what had happened. Peregrine must have assumed he'd been drowned while trying to cross the river, and instead of coming to his rescue, had somehow got into the chateau and was evidently bent on murdering everyone he could lay his hands on. Gladstone wanted to dissociate himself from the process. Rescuing countesses was one thing, but bunging bald-headed men off the top of cliffs was quite another. In any case, the blithering idiot would never make it. He'd get himself killed, and then... For the first time in his life, Gladstone had a glimmering sense of reality. That was more than could be said for Professor Botwick. Thanks to Peregrine's gruesome handling, he had been unconscious during his fall, and his limpness had saved him. Now he began to come round. It was a doubtful relief. For all his convictions that the future of the world depended on stockpiling weapons of mass, not to say universal destruction, the professor was an otherwise conventional family man, and to find himself lying soaked to the skin, being inflated by someone who hadn't shaved for 3 days and stank like a public urinal, was almost as traumatic as being strangled with a lungful of cigar smoke still inside him. With a desperate effort he tore his mouth away from Gladstone's. "What the fucking hell do you think you're doing?" he snarled feebly. Gladstone recoiled. He knew exactly what he'd been doing, reviving one of the most dangerous gangsters in the world. It didn't seem the time to say so. "Now, just take it easy," he muttered, and hoped to hell the swine wasn't carrying a gun. He should have thought of that before. "You've had a nasty fall, and you may have broken something." "Like what?" said Botwick, peering at his shape. "Well, I don't really know. I'm not an expert in these things, but you don't want to move in your condition." "That's what you fucking think," said Botwick, whose memory of some of the horrors he had been through was slowly returning. "Just wait till I lay my hands on the bastard who strangled me." "That's not what I mean," said Gladstone, who shared his feelings about Peregrine. I'm just advising you not to move. You could do yourself an injury." "When I get out of here, I'm going to do more than an injury to that son of a bitch. You better believe me. I am going to—" "Quite," said Gladstone, to prevent hearing the gory details. He didn't want any part of that retribution. "Anyway, it was a good thing I happened to be passing and saw you fall. You'd have been dead by now if I hadn't rescued you." "Yeah, I guess that's so," said Professor Botwick grudgingly. "And you say you saw me fall?" "Yes, I dived in and swam across and managed to pull you out," said Gladstone, and felt a little better. At least it established an alibi. Professor Botwick's next remark questioned it. "Let me tell you something, brother. I didn't fall. I was pushed." "Really?" said Gladstone, trying to mix belief with a reasonable scepticism. "I mean, you're sure you're not suffering from shock and concussion?" "Sure, I'm not sure," said Botwick, whose latent hypochondria had been understandably aroused. "The way I feel, I could have anything. But one thing's certain. Some goon jumped me, and the next thing, I'm down here. In between being strangled, of course." "Good Lord," said Gladstone. "Did you, see who, jumped you?" "No," said Botwick grimly. "I sure as shit mean to find out, and when I do—" He tried to raise himself onto an elbow, but Gladstone intervened. It was awful enough to be stranded on a ledge with a murderous gangster without the swine learning that there was nothing much the matter with him. "Don't move," he squawked. "It's vital you don't move, especially your head." "My head? What's so special about my head?" asked Botwick. "It's not bleeding or something?" "Not as far as I can tell," said Gladstone, edging round towards the professor's feet. "Of course, it's too dark to see exactly, but I'd—" "So why the spiel about not moving it?" said Botwick, eyeing him nervously. "I'd rather not say," said Gladstone. "I'm just going to—" "Hold it there," said Botwick, now in a state of panic. "I don't give a dime-store damn what you'd rather not say. I want to hear it." I'm not sure you do. Well, I fucking am, and what the hell are you taking my shoes off for? Just making a few tests, said Gladstone. On my feet? So what's with my head? You start yapping about my fucking head and not moving it and all, and now you're doing some tests down there. Where's the goddamn connection? Your spine, said Gladstone somberly. The next moment he was having to hold the professor down. For heaven's sake, don't move. I mean, I know what you mean, squealed Botwick. Don't I just? Sweet Jesus, I've got to. You're telling me. Oh, my God! He fell back on the rock and lay still. Right, said Gladstone, delighted that at last he'd gained the upper hand. Now, I'm going to ask you to tell me if you feel anything when— Yes, I do! Screamed Botwick. Definitely! But I haven't done anything yet. Guy tells me he hasn't done anything yet. Just tells me my spine's broken. And that's nothing. How would you feel if you'd been strangled and dropped over a cliff and some limey at the bottom gives you a mouth-to-mouth and then says you got a broken spine and not to move your fucking head? You think I don't feel nothing? And what about my fucking wife? She's gonna love having me around the house all day and not being able to get it up at night. You don't know her. She's gonna be hot-tailing it with every— The prospect was evidently too much for him. He stopped and glared up at the sky. Now then, said Gladstone, getting his own back for being called a limey, if you feel— Don't say it, said Botwick. No way. I'm going to lie here and not move until it's light enough for you to swim back over there and get an ambulance and the best medical rescue team money can buy. And it was Gladstone's turn to panic. Now, wait a minute, he said, wishing to hell he hadn't boasted about swimming across so readily. I've sprained my ankle rescuing you. I can't go back into— Ankle yankle, shouted Botwick. You think I care about ankles in my fucking condition? You gotta be crazy. Somebody is, for sure. Oh, well, if you feel like that about it, said Gladstone, rather huffily, only to be stopped by Botwick. Feel, he yelled. Use that fucking word again and someone's gonna be sorry. Sorry, said Gladstone. All the same. Listen, bud, said Botwick. It's not all the same. Not to me it isn't. Your ankle and my spine are in two different categories, right? I suppose it'd have to be, said Gladstone. You don't need a fucking ankle to get it up and feel and all. Well, it's not that way with spines. Not the way I read it, so lay off the feeling part. Yes, said Gladstone, not too sure now if he'd been wise to raise the issue in the first place. All the same— Don't, said Botwick menacingly. I was going to say— I know what you were going to say, and I've answered that one already. It's not the fucking same. Same is out. Same as feel is. Even so, said Gladstone, after a pause in which he had searched for a phrase which wouldn't infuriate the blighter, for all we know, there may be nothing the matter with your spine. The way to find out is to take my fucking shoes off like you did just now, said Botwick. I got news for you. But whatever he was about to impart was drowned by the sound of sirens. A car, followed by an ambulance, hurtled along the road opposite and turned over the bridge to the chateau. For hell's sake, do something, yelled Botwick. We gotta get their attention. But Gladstone was too preoccupied to answer. Whatever Peregrine had done had included more than dumping this foul-mouthed swine over the cliff, and if he was caught— The notion horrified him. In the meantime, he'd better keep on good terms, or as near as he could get, with the sod. "Did you notice that?" he inquired, jabbing his finger into the sole of Botwick's foot when the professor had stopped shouting. Botwick sat bolt upright. "Of course I fucking did," he snarled. "What do you expect me to fucking notice if you do a thing like that? I got sensitive feet, for Christ's sake." "Oh, that's a relief," said Gladstone. "For a while there, I thought you'd really broken your back." "Jesus," said Botwick, and sank back, speechless, on the rock. Chapter 15.